The stagecoach left Tucson at 6:30 in the morning, and by the time the desert sun climbed high enough to make the air shimmer and bend, Evelyn Hartwell had already decided she hated Arizona. She sat wedged between a traveling salesman named Gerald, who smelled aggressively of bay rum and nervous perspiration, and a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who had not stopped talking since the coach lurched away from the depot. Mrs. Aldridge had opinions about everything: the territory roads, the territorial governor, the quality of biscuits at the last rest station, and she delivered each opinion with the kind of absolute certainty that made disagreement feel not just futile, but personally insulting. Evelyn said very little. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the brutal jolting of the road, and her gaze fixed on the window, where the landscape unrolled like something half-dreamed. Red earth, scrub brush, distant formations of rock that jutted from the desert floor like broken teeth. It was nothing like Philadelphia, nothing like the life she was trying to leave behind. She had one trunk in the luggage boot and $63 sewn into the lining of her coat. That was the sum total of Evelyn Hartwell's new beginning. The marriage had lasted 9 years. 9 years of careful management, of household accounts and social calendars, and the slow grinding labor of maintaining the appearance of a respectable life, while the interior of that life rotted quietly from the center outward. Richard had not been a violent man. He had been something worse, in her estimation. A man who was entirely indifferent. Indifferent to her thoughts, her work, her grief when the pregnancies failed, her loneliness in the large house that never quite felt like hers. He had been polite about the divorce, the way a man is polite when he is already relieved to have the situation resolved. She did not miss him. She was not entirely sure she had ever loved him, or if what she had felt at 26 had simply been the relief of being chosen by someone who looked stable. That was the part she was most ashamed of. Not the failure of the marriage, but the realization of how little it had been built on to begin with. Her sister Ruth lived in a place called Yuma in the Arizona Territory, and had been writing letters for 2 years urging Evelyn to come west. "Come and start fresh," Ruth had written. "It's not what you imagine. It's harder and stranger and more alive than anything back east, and I think that's exactly what you need." Evelyn had resisted for a long time. She was not someone who ran from things. She told herself that. But here she was, running from things, on a stagecoach that smelled of leather and dust and Gerald's bay rum, headed for a territory she did not know. She was trying to feel hopeful. She was mostly just tired. The first sign that something was wrong came around midday. Not a sound, but an absence of sound. The driver, a laconic man named Briggs, who had exchanged perhaps 11 words with the passengers since departure, went suddenly quiet on the box above. The coach slowed. Not gradually, the way it slowed for rough terrain, but in a short, tightening way that made the wheels skid slightly on the hard-packed road. Mrs. Aldridge stopped mid-sentence about biscuits. Gerald sat up straighter. Evelyn pressed closer to the window. Outside, the desert looked the same as it had all morning, flat and pale and brutal under the noon sun, except that it didn't. 4 men on horseback had appeared from somewhere, arrayed across the road in a loose line. They were not traveling, they were waiting. "Everyone stay still." The voice came from the box above, Briggs, very quiet. "Don't do anything sudden." One of the riders moved forward. He wore a canvas duster so dusty it had taken on the same reddish cast as the desert floor, and he carried a rifle across the saddle with the ease of a man who had done this before. He had a broad, flat face beneath a battered hat, and he was not hurrying. "Stop the coach," he called up. It was not a request. Briggs stopped the coach. What happened next moved in 2 contradictory speeds, very fast and very slow at once. The rider approached the door. Gerald made a sound like a man who has been struck in the chest. Mrs. Aldridge grabbed Evelyn's arm with both hands, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Out," the rider said when he had the door open. "All of you, leave your bags." The guard riding shotgun, a young man named Purvis, whom Evelyn had barely noticed at departure, made some small move from the box that she didn't see. What she heard was the crack of a rifle and then silence. And then Mrs. Aldridge was screaming. And then they were all stumbling down from the coach onto the hard red earth, and the sun was directly overhead, and there was nowhere to go. There were 4 riders, and no cover within 200 yards in any direction. Evelyn had her reticule with her. Out of habit, she had looped it around her wrist when the coach slowed. Inside it was a small folding knife that her sister Ruth had sent in a package 6 months ago with a note that said, "I know you'll think this is dramatic. Carry it anyway." She had thought it was dramatic. She had carried it anyway. She pressed her arm against her side and felt the shape of the reticule against her hip and did not reach for the knife because she was not stupid. 4 men with rifles. A knife. She kept her breathing even and her face as expressionless as she could manage, which was not very expressionless because her hands were shaking. The flat-faced man was speaking to Briggs about the strongbox. The other 3 riders had spread out around the passengers, 2 of them watching, one of them going through the luggage boot with business-like efficiency. Gerald had already handed over his watch and his billfold. Mrs. Aldridge was crying in a high, breathless way that she seemed unable to control, and Evelyn was watching the rider nearest to her and thinking, with a clarity that surprised her, "If he gets any closer, I will use the knife, and I will probably die for it, and I don't particularly care." It was the not particularly caring that frightened her more than the rider. Then 2 things happened. The rider nearest to her shifted his attention away, looking back toward the coach, responding to something one of the others said, and in that same moment Evelyn heard hoofbeats, not from the road ahead, from the east, from the broken ground beyond the scrub brush, fast and coming faster. 1 rider. The flat-faced man heard it too. He turned and his expression changed. Not fear exactly, but a recalculation, a rapid and unwilling reassessment. The other outlaws were turning their horses, hands moving toward weapons. The rider came out of the scrub at a pace that didn't make sense for the terrain, a gray horse moving at full extension, and the man on its back was young. That was her first impression. Absurdly. Young, and riding like the horse was part of him, leaning low, and he had a revolver in his right hand and a rifle across his back. He did not slow down. "Colt!" one of the outlaws shouted, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite a name and not quite a warning, something like, "Oh no." What followed was loud and chaotic, and lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though it felt much longer. Evelyn pulled Mrs. Aldridge to the ground behind the coach wheel. Gerald had flattened himself against the coach's side. There was shooting, a lot of it, and dust, and the sound of horses screaming, which was a sound Evelyn had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. When it was over, 2 of the outlaws were down. One was fleeing back the way he had come. The flat-faced man had his hands up, and the young rider had a revolver trained on him with a steadiness that seemed completely at odds with the chaos of the last 3 minutes. "Drop the rifle," the rider said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing that struck her. How quiet his voice was after all that noise. The flat-faced man dropped the rifle. "Get off the horse. Slow." The man got off the horse. "Sit down in the dirt." A pause. Then the flat-faced man sat down in the dirt. The young rider swung down from the gray horse in one motion and pulled a length of rope from his saddlebag without once letting the revolver waver. He crossed to the flat-faced man and crouched behind him and had the man's hands bound before Evelyn had quite processed what she was watching. Then he stood and looked over at the passengers behind the wheel. He was, as she had thought, young, maybe 26, 27, lean in the way of men who work in the sun and don't eat enough, with dark hair under a sweat-stained hat and eyes the color of creek water, that particular shifting gray-green that changes depending on the light. His face was not remarkable except for the expression on it, which was somewhere between exhausted and alert, in a combination she couldn't quite read. "Anyone hurt?" he said. "The guard," Evelyn said before she had decided to speak. "Purvis. He was shot." The young man's jaw tightened. He went around the side of the coach and came back after a moment. His face had closed in a way that told her what she already feared. "I'm sorry," he said, to no one in particular and to all of them. Mrs. Aldridge began crying again, less frantic now, more genuine. Gerald had found his voice and was offering a trembling account of events that was largely inaccurate. Briggs, the driver, had climbed down from the box and was assessing the situation with the grim practicality of a man who has seen the territory's worst and accepted that this is simply what it is. Evelyn stood up slowly, brushing dust from her skirt, and looked at the young rider. He was checking on his horse, running a hand down the gray's near foreleg with the attentiveness of someone who cares more about the animal than he'd ever admit. There was a cut on his left forearm. Not deep, she thought, but bleeding steadily through his shirt sleeve. You're bleeding, she said. He glanced at his arm. I know. It should be cleaned. Yep. Do you have anything in your saddlebag? He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that felt evaluative without being unkind. You're not from around here, he said. No, she agreed. You're all going to need to come with me, he said, addressing the group now. Town's about 4 miles. Can't leave you out here. There were more of them earlier this morning, and I don't know where the other one went. He paused. I'm Colt Mercer. I ride for the Red Mesa Crossing Ranchers Association. I won't hurt you. We know that, Evelyn said, which she recognized was perhaps a more definitive statement than the situation warranted, since they had known this man for approximately 4 minutes. But something in her had decided, and her instincts, which she had spent 9 years ignoring in favor of reason, were insisting on being heard. Colt Mercer looked at her again with that same quiet evaluation. What's your name? He said. Evelyn Hartwell. He nodded once. Then he turned and went to retrieve his horse and said nothing further, which struck her as a very sensible approach to the current circumstances. The 4 miles to Red Mesa Crossing took nearly 2 hours, given the pace they could manage. Briggs drove with one of the outlaw's horses tied to the back. The flat-faced man rode inside the coach, hands bound, saying nothing. Colt Mercer rode alongside on his gray horse, and Evelyn found herself watching him through the window in a way she told herself was simply practical observation. He moved like the desert had made him. There was no other way to put it. He read the terrain with his eyes in constant small sweeps, without appearing to be doing anything in particular. He checked their back trail regularly. When the road dipped into a dry wash and the coach lurched badly on the grade, he was already at the wheel before Briggs called down, anticipating the problem rather than reacting to it. He was also, she noticed, very young. Not young in the sense of inexperienced, clearly not that, but young in the sense of time, of how much of it he still had. She kept coming back to this with a discomfort she couldn't entirely account for. She was 35. She felt about 112. Red Mesa Crossing came into view from the top of a low rise, and even in her current condition, dusty and shaken and still faintly aware that she might have died 2 hours ago, Evelyn felt something ease slightly in her chest at the sight of it. It was not much to look at. A main street of packed earth bordered by wooden buildings, most of them sun-bleached to a pale gray. A livery stable. A general store. What appeared to be a doctor's office. A hotel with a sign that said rooms, which she read as the most beautiful word she had encountered in recent memory. But there were also people. A woman sweeping her porch who looked up and shaded her eyes. 2 men who came out of the feed store and stood watching the approach of the coach with the alert stillness of people who have learned to read incoming news before it arrives. A handful of children who appeared from somewhere and began running alongside. The children were what did it. The children running alongside the coach, shouting questions up at Briggs, one of them reaching up to slap the side panel as if for luck. Evelyn pressed her hand flat against the window glass and felt, without warning and without permission, a profound and embarrassing urge to cry. She did not cry. She pressed her knuckles hard against her mouth and breathed through it. Get a hold of yourself, she thought, with the firm internal voice she had developed over years of needing it. You are fine. You are not hurt. You are fine. The doctor's name was Yates, a spare man in his 60s who smelled of carbolic and tobacco and moved with the efficiency of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by what humans do to each other. He was examining the cut on Colt's arm when Evelyn came in. At Colt's direction, not her own initiative, because he had said, Doc Yates will want to look you over too, in the same straightforward way he said everything, and she had found herself following him into the office before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. Sit there, Yates said, gesturing at a second chair without looking up from Colt's arm. I'll be with you in a minute. I'm not injured, Evelyn said. Shock does interesting things to people. Sit down, Mrs. Hartwell. She sat. Colt was watching Yates work on his arm with the expression of a man who has been through this before and has made his peace with the discomfort. The cut was longer than she had realized, 4 inches at least, ragged at one end. And Yates was cleaning it with something that smelled strongly enough to make Evelyn's eyes water from across the room. Knife? Yates asked. Fence wire, Colt said. On the way in. This morning? About 2 hours ago, Yates grunted. You going to tell me what happened out there? What I know, Colt said, which isn't all of it. Briggs can tell you more. The stagecoach guard is dead. I know. Young kid, Purvis, hadn't been on the route 2 months. Colt said nothing. He was looking at the wall past Yates's shoulder, and his jaw had gone tight again in that same way it had when he'd come back around from the coach. You couldn't have been there faster, Yates said, not gently exactly, but with precision, the way a doctor says a thing. No, Colt agreed. Then, after a pause, that doesn't help much. No, it doesn't, Yates agreed equally. He tied off the bandage and sat back. You'll live. Leave it alone for a week. 3 days, Colt said. I said a week. I heard you. Yates made a sound that conveyed his opinion of this exchange without wasting actual words on it. He turned to Evelyn. Now then, any pain? Dizziness? No, she said. You're pale. I'm always pale. It's a complexion. Something moved in Colt Mercer's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the slight shift of the face before amusement makes it all the way up. She keeps her head, he said. Not to Yates. Not quite to her either. More like a thing he was noting to himself. Is that surprising? Evelyn said. He looked at her. Most people don't. Out there. He paused. Men included. I was terrified, she said, in case that wasn't clear. It wasn't, he said. Not from where I was. Yates was ignoring both of them with professional thoroughness, pressing 2 fingers against the pulse point on Evelyn's wrist and watching his pocket watch. You'll be fine, he said after a moment. You should eat something. You should rest. The hotel here is decent enough. Mabel Ostrander keeps it. I'm headed to Yuma, Evelyn said. My sister is expecting me. Next coach west doesn't run until day after tomorrow, Yates said. So you're staying tonight at minimum. She had known this roughly before he said it and had been calculating around it the whole drive in. She had $63. A room for 2 nights was manageable. Her sister would understand a delay. This was all fine. These were all solvable problems. All right, she said. Colt stood, rolling down his sleeve over the bandaged arm with a care that suggested the movement was painful without giving that information away in his face. He settled his hat. I'll take you over to the hotel, he said to Evelyn. Introduce you to Mabel. You don't need to. I know. He held the door open. She considered pointing out again that she did not require an escort across a single street. Then she thought about the way he had checked their back trail every 5 minutes on the road in, and she thought about the outlaw who had fled, and she walked through the door. Mabel Ostrander was a woman of approximately 50 who had the look of someone who had been many other kinds of person before she became the person who ran a hotel in the Arizona Territory. She was stout and sharp-eyed and wore her gray-streaked hair in a braid down her back like a girl, and when Colt Mercer walked in with Evelyn behind him, she looked at the bandage on his arm first and his face second. How bad? She said. Fence wire, he said. And the coach? Guard didn't make it. Mabel's face did something complicated and then was still. Purvis? Yes, ma'am. A pause. His mother's in Flagstaff, she said, more to herself than to either of them. I'll write to her, Colt said. Mabel looked at him for a long moment with an expression that Evelyn couldn't entirely decipher. Something between affection and worry and the particular weariness of caring about someone who regularly puts himself in danger. Then she transferred her gaze to Evelyn with the frank assessment of a woman who has learned to read people quickly. And you are? Evelyn Hartwell, from Philadelphia. I was on the coach. Philadelphia? Mabel tilted her head slightly. Long way from home. Yes, Evelyn agreed. It is. Well, you'll want a room and a bath and something to eat in that order. She pulled a key from the board behind the desk. Room 4. It's at the back, quieter. Tub's at the end of the hall. I'll have the water heated. Thank you, Evelyn said. How much for 2 nights? We'll sort that out after you've eaten. Mabel handed over the key. Colt, you eaten? Not since this morning. Sit down then. I'll feed you too. She said it in exactly the way someone says it when they have been feeding this particular person since he was not very old and have long since stopped asking if he wants it. Evelyn paused at the base of the stairs. Colt Mercer was taking off his hat, sitting down at the table near the window, looking out at the main street with the same alert scanning she'd noticed on the road, checking it automatically, not from anxiety but from habit, the way a person breathes. His profile in the afternoon light was young and tired and sharp-featured, and there was something about the line of his shoulders, the way he held himself, that struck her as carrying more weight than a man his age should have to carry. She caught herself looking. She went up the stairs. The bath was the best thing that had happened to her in 18 months, possibly longer. She stayed in the tub until the water went cold, and she did not think about the outlaws or the gunshots or the way Purvis's boots had been visible from under the coach. She thought about her sister Ruth's last letter, the one that had finally made her decide to come. "I know it seems like running," Ruth had written. Maybe it is. But sometimes the direction you're running matters more than the fact that you're running at all. She had thought that was a little convenient as philosophy. She still thought so. But she was here, and she was alive, and the bathwater was warm, and for now that was enough to work with. When she came downstairs, cleaned and in a fresh dress from her trunk, Colt Mercer was still at the table. He had a plate that had been emptied and a cup of coffee that hadn't, and he was writing something in a small notebook with the labored concentration of a man for whom writing does not come naturally. He looked up when she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Feeling better?" he said. "Considerably." She hesitated, then went to the table because Mabel had appeared from the kitchen and was already setting a plate across from Colt, with the air of someone who has decided how things are going to be arranged. "What are you writing?" He closed the notebook. "Letter." She realized then, what letter? The flush that went through her was not comfortable. "I'm sorry," she said. "You don't have to." "It's all right." He picked up his coffee cup. "Better to do it now than put it off." She sat. Mabel put food in front of her. Salt pork and beans and cornbread that was denser than anything they made back east and better for it. And she ate, and for a while neither of them said anything. The silence was not uncomfortable. That surprised her. She was a person who found silences uncomfortable as a rule, who tended to fill them. But the silence across this table felt like something else, like the quiet after a storm, when the air is washed clean. "How long have you been out here?" she asked, finally. "On the frontier." He thought about it. "Since I was 16. 11 years, she calculated. She was doing the arithmetic before she stopped herself, which was irritating. "Where from, before that?" "Missouri." A short pause. That was a different life. She understood that formulation better than she would have liked. "Yes," she said. "Some of them are." He looked at her with that same considering steadiness. "What are you headed to Yuma for?" "My sister lives there. I'm starting over." She said it plainly, without the usual softening. The events of the day had burned away some of her tolerance for polite evasion. "From what?" She raised an eyebrow. "Sorry," he said, without much evidence of being sorry. "Frontier manners." "A marriage that ended," she said, "and a life that didn't fit." He nodded once, which was neither too sympathetic nor too dismissive, and she appreciated the calibration of it. "What does the Ranchers Association do?" she asked. "Is that like a lawman?" "Sort of. Territory marshals spread thin. We fill in the gaps, escort payroll, track down missing livestock, deal with—" a slight pause. "Situations like today." "Do situations like today happen often?" "Often enough." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The Dugan outfit's been working this stretch of road for about 3 months. Today was the 3rd coach they've hit." "And you knew they'd hit this one?" "Had word they might. Got out there as fast as I could." The jaw tightened again briefly. "Not fast enough." "You saved 4 people," she said. "Purvis was one of us," he said. She understood what he meant. The not fast enough would stay with him, and no accounting of what he had done right would balance it in his mind. She recognized that particular kind of carrying. She had done it herself in other contexts, and with other names on it. "That's a heavy thing," she said carefully, "to feel responsible for the gap between what you could do and what needed to be done." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "That's exactly what it is." Outside, the desert sun was dropping toward the horizon and painting the main street of Red Mesa Crossing in colors that had no good equivalents in the Philadelphia palette, deep rose and ochre, and a particular shade of orange that seemed to come from inside the dust itself. Evelyn looked out the window and thought that her sister had been right, though she would not be admitting that until she had something better to report than "I nearly got shot and the sunset is pretty." Across the table, Colt Mercer opened his notebook again. She watched him try to find the right first line of the letter and discard several attempts, and she did not offer to help because he hadn't asked, and because some things a person needs to do in their own words even when it's hard. She finished her meal. She listened to the sounds of the settlement settling into evening. Someone playing a fiddle somewhere, a horse moving in the livery, the distant bark of a dog going quiet. She was not where she had planned to be tonight. She was not who she had planned to be, for that matter, after 9 years of trying to be someone else's idea of a wife. But she was here, in this plain room, in this hard country, and she had kept her head when it mattered. And the beans were good, and the man across the table was writing a careful and probably terrible first line of a letter to a dead boy's mother. Tomorrow would be complicated. She was very good at complicated. She asked Mabel for more coffee, and Mabel brought it, and the evening came down quiet over Red Mesa Crossing, like a hand smoothing a sheet. The next morning arrived the way mornings do in the desert, all at once, bright and merciless and indifferent to whether you were ready. Evelyn was ready. She had slept more than she'd expected, deeply and without dreaming, in a bed that was narrow and not particularly soft and entirely adequate. She dressed and pinned her hair and went downstairs before 7, which was earlier than she usually managed, but which felt right today, as if the day were a thing she needed to get ahead of, rather than be carried along by. Mabel was already in the kitchen and handed over coffee without being asked, which Evelyn immediately elevated to one of her top 5 experiences of the past year. The dining room was mostly empty. A man she didn't recognize was eating in the far corner. Near the door, a woman in her 30s sat with a girl of about 7, both of them quiet in the particular way of people waiting for news they are not sure they want. Evelyn took her coffee to the window table and watched the street. Colt came in at 7:15. He had clearly been awake for some time. His clothes were clean, but his eyes had that particular hollowness that comes from a night without enough sleep. He carried his hat in his hand and stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room before he located her, and his face arranged itself into something that she was starting to recognize as his version of a greeting. He came and sat across from her without asking, which she did not object to. "Letter?" she said. "Sent it on the morning rider." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Wrote it 4 times. Good ones always take 4 times. He looked at her. "How would you know?" "I was a school teacher," she said, "before the marriage. I wrote a great many letters to parents about their children, and the good ones always took 4 times. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "You taught school. For 6 years, reading, writing, arithmetic, some history." She sipped her coffee. "I was good at it." "Why'd you stop?" "Because I married a man who found it embarrassing to have a wife with a job," she said. She had not intended to say it quite that directly, but mornings in the desert apparently did something to her filters. Colt absorbed this. "That's a waste," he said. "Yes," she agreed. It was. Mabel came with his breakfast and more coffee for both of them, and for a little while they ate in the same comfortable quiet as the previous evening. Outside, the settlement was coming to life. A wagon rattling past, the blacksmith shop throwing its first sparks of the day, 2 women talking in front of the general store. Then the door opened and 3 children came in. They were not shy children. They were approximately the opposite of shy children. A girl of 9 or 10 in a dress that had been mended so many times it had become a record of itself, and twin boys of perhaps 7 who moved with the coordinated chaos of people who have never once in their lives needed to be careful about taking up space. They saw Colt and immediately changed direction toward his table, and he saw them coming, and his face did something it hadn't done yet in Evelyn's observation. It went warm. "Mornin', Mr. Colt," the girl said. "Mornin', Sadie." He reached out and flicked one of the twin boys on the brim of his hat. "You boys stay out of the livery last night?" "Mostly," one of the twins said. "What part of mostly?" "The early part," the other twin admitted. "Mm-hmm." He looked at them without severity and considerable resignation. Then he seemed to register Evelyn, watching this exchange with what she hoped was not too obvious an expression of amusement, and he made the introduction with the brevity of someone to whom social niceties are a foreign language he has learned phonetically. "This is Mrs. Hartwell. She was on the stage yesterday." Mrs. Hartwell, this is Sadie and Tom, and the other one's Billy. The other one, Billy said, aggrieved. You're 3 minutes younger, Tom said. That doesn't make me the other one. Gentlemen, Evelyn said, which stopped both boys short because no one had called them gentlemen before, and it landed with the weight of an unexpected gift. I'm pleased to meet you, and Sadie. Sadie looked at her with the evaluative directness of a 9-year-old who has learned to take people's measure fast. Are you from far away? Philadelphia, Evelyn said, in Pennsylvania. That's east, Sadie said, near the ocean. Not right on it, but yes, not too far. We don't have an ocean, Tom or Billy said. No, Evelyn agreed, but you have that. She nodded at the window, at the morning light on the red rocks visible in the distance beyond the street. Which I think might be better. Sadie looked out the window and then back at Evelyn with a slight reorientation of her expression, as if she had just received unexpected information about the value of something she passed every day. Are you staying? She asked. Just until the next coach, Evelyn said. Day after tomorrow. The girl's face did something careful. Oh, she said. Do you go to school here? Evelyn asked, changing the subject with the instincts of someone who has spent years managing rooms full of children. When there is one, Tom said. Miss Harlow went back east last month. She got married, Billy added, to someone in St. Louis. We haven't had school in 3 weeks, Sadie said. This was delivered as a plain statement of fact, but underneath it was the specific frustration of a child who actually wants to learn and has no way of making that happen. Evelyn looked at Colt, who was watching her watch the children with an expression she couldn't read. She looked back at Sadie. Well, she said slowly, I have 2 days. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. The words came from somewhere that operated independently of her better judgment, the part of her that had sat in classrooms for 6 years and had never once looked at a child in front of her without wanting to give them something useful to carry. But she had said it, and Sadie's face had done what it did when you said something true and important to a child who needed to hear it, which was, go completely still, and then very bright, and there was no taking it back. Colt said nothing. He drank his coffee and watched Main Street through the window, but she could feel his attention on her the same way you feel the heat from a fire that isn't directly in front of you. Could you really? Sadie asked. Teach us? I'd need to know where the school is, Evelyn said, and whether there's a board or a council or someone who gives permission for these things. Mayor Alderman, Colt said. He runs the general store. He'll say yes before you finish asking. You know that? He's been trying to find a replacement teacher since before Miss Harlow left. A pause. It's a small town. People know what it needs. Evelyn considered the 2 days she had. She considered Sadie's face. She considered, though she tried not to, the fact that this was the most useful she had felt in several years. All right, she said. Sadie's smile arrived all at once, the kind that takes over a face before the person behind it has decided to allow it. I'll tell the others, she said, and she was already moving toward the door, the twins scrambling to keep up with her, and the door banged behind them, and the dining room felt larger and quieter in their wake. Evelyn became aware that she was smiling too. She stopped. Across the table, Colt was watching her with an expression that she was beginning to understand was his careful version of paying attention. 2 days, he said. 2 days, she agreed. People here get attached fast, he said. Not as a warning, exactly. Not as an observation either. Something in between. She looked at him steadily. So I've heard. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back out the window. The morning light was doing what morning light does in the desert, turning everything it touched into something that looked temporary and irreplaceable at once. Evelyn watched it move across the rooftops, and the red earth, and the distant rocks, and she thought about 2 days and what could be accomplished in them, and she was careful not to think about what might be harder to leave than she had anticipated. She asked Mabel for more coffee. Mabel brought it without comment, with the air of a woman who has seen this particular kind of thing begin before and knows better than to say anything at all. Mayor Alderman said yes before she finished asking. He said it the way a man says yes when he has been waiting for someone to offer the thing he needs most and has given up expecting it. He was behind the counter of the general store sorting dried beans into a glass jar, and when Evelyn introduced herself and explained that she had taught school for 6 years in Philadelphia and was willing to hold class for the next 2 days. While she waited for the westbound coach, he set down the jar and said, "When can you start?" with a directness that bypassed every other possible response. "Tomorrow morning," Evelyn said. 8 o'clock, if that suits." "It suits," he said. He was a compact man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the particular look of someone who has spent years watching the thing his town needs walk right through it, headed somewhere else. "How many children do you think you'll get?" Sadie mentioned others. "I'm not certain how many. 15, maybe 18 if the ranch families can send theirs in." He paused. "We haven't had a regular teacher in 2 months. Before Miss Harlow, it was a man named Crawford, and before him the minister's wife did it, but she passed 3 years ago. We've been patching it together." "I understand," Evelyn said. "We can't pay much for 2 days." "I'm not asking to be paid," she said. "I'm a traveler with time and a skill. It would be wasteful not to use it." Alderman looked at her over the counter with a careful, appraising steadiness that reminded her of the way Colt Mercer looked at things, as if he had learned somewhere along the way that first impressions are a starting point and not a conclusion. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Yuma. My sister lives there." He nodded. "You ever been west before?" "No." He picked up his jar and resumed sorting beans. "It changes people," he said. "Not as a warning, more like a weather report. Most of them." She did not ask whether that was a good thing. She thanked him and left, and the bell over the door made its small sound behind her, and the morning was already getting warm. The schoolhouse was one room with 8 desks and 2 long benches and a blackboard that had been wiped imperfectly clean so that the ghost of previous lessons lingered in pale chalk dust. Multiplication tables overlaid with what appeared to be the outline of a map. There was a dictionary on the teacher's desk that had been repaired along the spine with a strip of rawhide. The windows faced east, which meant good morning light and terrible afternoon heat, and someone had wedged a piece of wood under the rear legs of the teacher's desk to compensate for the uneven floor. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room and took it in. It was not the schoolroom she had left. That one had been in a brick building with oil paper on the windows and proper desks and a working stove that heated adequately through a Philadelphia winter. This one had gaps in the wallboards where the wind would come through in cold weather, and a door that didn't quite close all the way, and a smell of dust and old chalk, and the particular hotwood smell of a building that has been sitting in the sun. She loved it. That was the honest answer, and it arrived before she had time to be sensible about it. She loved the slant of the morning light through the east-facing windows, and the battered dictionary, and the bored ghost of someone else's lesson. She had spent 9 years in rooms that were well-appointed and cold, and this one was shabby and immediately alive in a way she could feel in the soles of her feet. She went to the board and found chalk in the tray and wrote, "Welcome. My name is Mrs. Hartwell." Then she found a cloth and started on the windows. She was halfway through the 3rd window when she heard footsteps on the wooden step outside, and Colt Mercer appeared in the doorway, which did not surprise her as much as it might have, given that she had noticed over the past 24 hours that he had a way of appearing in places where she was without making a production of it. "Alderman sent over some extra benches," he said, jerking his head back at the wagon in the street. "Thought you might need them." "That was thoughtful. You want them inside?" "Please." He brought in 2 benches with the help of a teenager she hadn't met, and they arranged them along the south wall, and then the teenager left and Colt stayed, which she was also not particularly surprised by. "You swept this?" he said, looking at the floor. "I found a broom," she said, still working on the window. "The previous person left it in a reasonable state, actually, mostly just dust." He walked to the front of the room and stood looking at the board where she'd written her name. Something in his posture was quiet and attentive in a way that had nothing to do with the physical room. "You wrote it out," he said. "The welcome?" "Yeah." A pause. "Miss Harlow just used to put the date." Evelyn climbed down from the chair she'd been standing on to reach the upper corner of the window. "The date is less welcoming than a name," she said. He turned to look at her. "You have a way of thinking about things," he said. "Does that surprise you?" He considered it. "No," he said. "Not anymore." She set the cloth down and looked at him across the room. He was standing in the chalk dust light in his usual way, hat in hand, weight settled back slightly on his heels, and he was looking at her in the particular way he'd been looking at her since the morning of the ambush. Not too long, not speculative, but with the particular focused attention of someone who is learning the shape of something they didn't expect to encounter. Colt, she said, because she had decided somewhere between yesterday evening and this morning that using his name directly was simply more efficient than any other approach. I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly rather than politely. All right? Are those outlaws, the ones who got away, are they likely to come through town? He didn't flinch from it. Possibly. The one who ran, his name's Eli Dugan, brother of the man I tied up. He's smart, and he's not going to feel good about what happened. So you'll be watching. Already am. Is there anything I should know? Anything that changes what I should do in the next 2 days? He thought about it seriously. Stay on Main Street and near the hotel after dark. Don't go out to the edge of town alone. Other than that, he shook his head. They wouldn't go after a school teacher. It doesn't serve them. I'm the one they'll be thinking about. That's a reassuring thing to say, and not particularly reassuring. No, he agreed, without apology. It's not. He turned his hat in his hands. I'll be near. I didn't ask you to be, she said. I know, he said. I'm telling you, not asking your permission. She opened her mouth and then closed it, because the honest response was, I know, and I'm glad. And she was not going to say that, and it was frustrating that he could produce that particular response in her without appearing to be trying. Fine, she said. Fine, he agreed, and put his hat on and went out into the morning, and she went back to the windows. 17 children arrived the next morning. They ranged in age from 5, a girl named Clara, who had brought her doll to school and placed it on the desk as if it also required an education, to 14, a tall boy named Marcus, who had the self-conscious posture of someone caught between childhood and something larger and not entirely comfortable with the transition. The twins, Tom and Billy, arrived 4 minutes late and took the bench in the back with the air of men who prefer the rear of any room. Sadie sat in the first row and had already read ahead to the 3rd page of the primer Evelyn had borrowed from Alderman's store. What Evelyn had forgotten, or not forgotten exactly, but failed to keep in the front of her mind during the 9 years she hadn't done this, was the quality of a room full of children at the beginning of a lesson. Not the noise of it, though there was noise. The quality of the attention. Children, unlike adults, have not yet learned to hide what they are interested in. When something catches them, it catches them completely, and you can see it happen. The moment when a face goes from waiting to actually present, and it is the most immediate thing Evelyn had ever found in a room. She started with the basics, reading levels, arithmetic, who knew what, and discovered inside of an hour that the older children were further behind than they should have been through no fault of their own, and the younger ones were sharper than the older ones gave them credit for. Sadie, at 9, was reading at a level that would not have embarrassed a 14-year-old in Philadelphia. Marcus, at 14, was doing arithmetic on his fingers. Evelyn adjusted. That was the core skill she had developed over 6 years, the one that could not be learned from a book, reading the room and adjusting. She broke them into groups by skill rather than age, and watched the social dynamics shift accordingly, Marcus discovering that he could help a 7-year-old with letters even if his own arithmetic needed work, and in helping the 7-year-old discover that explaining something is the fastest way to understand it yourself. By mid-morning, she had chalk dust in her hair, and her voice was getting ragged, and she was the most engaged she had been in recent memory. During the noon break, when the children scattered out into the yard with their lunches, Sadie stayed behind. She sat at her desk with the primer open to a page she had clearly already read and was pretending to still be reading, which was such a transparent piece of behavior that Evelyn had to look away briefly to prevent Sadie from seeing her expression. "Sadie," she said, coming to sit at the desk beside her. "What is it?" The girl closed the primer very precisely. She was 9 and careful about herself in the way that children are when they have learned that their feelings are sometimes inconvenient to the adults around them. "Are you really going the day after tomorrow?" she asked. "That's when the coach runs, yes." "Nobody ever stays," Sadie said. Not with accusation. With a kind of flat, stated acceptance that was worse than accusation. Miss Harlow went. Mr. Crawford before her, the doctor before Doc Yates. He only stayed 6 months. People come and they go and we just... She stopped, smoothed the cover of the primer with her palm. "We just keep being here." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the right thing to say, and simultaneously aware that children can detect the right thing to say from 40 yards and are not particularly comforted by it. "That's true," she said. "People do come and go, and I am leaving day after tomorrow. I'm not going to tell you something different." Sadie looked at her. "But I want you to hear something else," Evelyn continued. "You read better than most children twice your age in a city with a proper school. That didn't happen because people stayed. That happened because you kept working at it even when the teacher was gone and there was no school and no one was telling you to." The girl's chin moved slightly. "My mama reads to me," she said, "at night." "Your mama sounds like a good teacher," Evelyn said, "and so do you. You were explaining the long division to Tom this morning, and you were doing it correctly, and you were patient with him when he didn't get it the first time. That is harder than doing it yourself." Sadie looked at the desk. A small war was happening in her face between accepting the compliment and bracing for whatever came after it. "It doesn't mean I have to not be sad that you're leaving," she said. "No," Evelyn agreed. "It doesn't mean that at all." They sat there for a moment in the quiet of the empty classroom, and outside the children were shouting in the yard, and the noon light came through the east windows at a low slant and caught the chalk dust still hanging in the air from the morning's work. "I'll write to Mayor Alderman," Evelyn said, "when I get to Yuma, about finding a proper teacher, someone who wants to stay. I'll write to some people I know in the East." Sadie looked up. "You would do that?" "I'm going to do it regardless. I'm just telling you so you know." The girl held her gaze for a moment with that 9-year-old directness that cuts through everything you've carefully arranged in your expression. Then she picked up her primer and went outside, and the door bumped behind her, and Evelyn sat alone in the classroom for another minute before she went to the board to prepare the afternoon lesson. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. Colt was outside the schoolhouse when the day ended, which she had expected, though not quite so literally. He was leaning against the hitching post across the street, doing nothing in particular except being very alert while appearing relaxed, which she had noticed was a skill he had refined to a high degree. The children flowed past him on their way home, and several of them said things to him. Billy reporting on the arithmetic lesson with more enthusiasm than he had shown during it, Sadie simply touching his arm as she passed in a gesture of comfortable familiarity that told Evelyn something about how long these children had known him. He responded to each with the same brief attentiveness, not performative, just present. She crossed the street when the last of them had gone. "How was it?" he said. 17 children, she said. 3 reading levels, 4 arithmetic levels, 2 boys who have made it a personal project to confound me, and 1 9-year-old who should be running the school rather than attending it. The corner of his mouth lifted. "That's Sadie. She told me people always leave." The half-smile settled into something more complicated. "She's not wrong." "I know." Evelyn stopped beside him at the hitching post and looked up the street where the late afternoon light was doing its evening work on the storefronts. Everything golden and briefly beautiful and a little precarious, the way beauty is in places that don't have much margin for error. "How long have you known them? The children?" "Tom and Billy came with their family about 4 years ago. Sadie," a pause. "Sadie's mama came here 7 years back. Husband didn't make it through the first winter. Hard country. He said the last 2 words the way you say something true that doesn't need any more weight added to it. And you look out for them. Somebody has to." That's not quite an answer. He looked at her sideways. "I like them," he said, in the slightly reluctant tone of a man admitting something he considers obvious. "They're good kids, Sadie especially. She's—" He stopped, seemed to consider what word to use. "She's sharp in a way that's going to take her somewhere, if someone gives her the tools." Evelyn thought about Sadie's hand smoothing the primer cover. "She needs a permanent teacher," she said. "A real one. Someone committed to staying." "I know. Town knows it." He pushed off from the hitching post and looked at her in the evening light. "Did you know the school salary's better than what most of the ranch hands make?" "I didn't," she said. "Not everything about the frontier is as hard as it looks," he said. "Some things are just waiting for the right person to see them clear." She was fairly certain he was talking about the teaching position, and less certain that he was only talking about the teaching position. The uncertainty was uncomfortable in a way she had not anticipated when she woke up that morning. "You should eat," he said, which was a very convenient change of subject. I was just going to say the same thing to you. They walked back toward the hotel, and the dust of the main street was warm under her feet, and the evening was coming down, and someone in the distance was playing that fiddle again. A different tune tonight, slower, not quite sad. The second day of school was harder than the first in all the ways that second days tend to be. The novelty had worn off, and what was left was actual work, and actual work produces friction, and friction produces revelation, if you let it. Marcus was the revelation of the second day. He was 14 and tall, and had been sitting in the back of the room with the carefully arranged indifference of a boy who has learned that wanting things and not getting them is more painful than not wanting things in the first place. On the first day, he had done the minimum, answered when called on, helped the younger children when Evelyn directed him to. On the second day, she put a long division problem on the board that was genuinely difficult and told the room to work on it independently, and Marcus sat with his paper for 10 minutes doing nothing, and then he picked up his pencil and started working it through. He got it wrong the first time. She watched him check his answer, know it was wrong, erase, and start again without asking for help, which was either pride or determination, and in a 14-year-old, the line between those two things was very fine. The second time he got it right. He stared at the paper for a moment, and then he looked up, and Evelyn caught his eye and nodded once, the way you nod when you mean yes. That's correct. And also I saw you do that. His face went carefully flat to conceal what it was doing, which was being pleased. She wrote a harder problem on the board. He did that one too. At the noon break, she stopped him before he went out. Marcus, she said, how much school have you had? He shrugged the elaborate shrug of a boy pretending not to care about the answer to a question. Some. Off and on. Can you read? Some. Fluently? The shrug again, then more quietly. Not like Sadie. No, she agreed. Sadie's unusual. But you can do the arithmetic better than children 3 years older than you. Do you understand that? He looked at the floor. Marcus? Yes, ma'am. That's a real thing. That's not a small thing. She let that sit for a moment. If you had a proper school, with a real teacher, for 2 or 3 years, you could go further with it. There are men who make their livings calculating. Engineers, surveyors, accountants. They're not rare, but they're valued. He looked up then. His face was still doing the careful arrangement, but underneath it, something was paying very close attention. This ain't a real school, he said. No, not yet. She held his gaze. It could be. He went outside. She went back to the board, and her chest felt tight and productive in the way it always had after a lesson that had done what it was supposed to do. That evening, something changed. She knew it as soon as she came into the dining room of the hotel, and Mabel's face arranged itself into the particular expression of a woman who is deciding whether to say a thing or not. What is it? Evelyn said. There's been some news, Mabel said. Colt's in the back. He wanted to talk to you when you came in. She found him in the small sitting room behind the dining room, which was less a sitting room than a collection of chairs that had accumulated over time without any particular plan. He was standing by the window rather than sitting, which told her something before he said a word. Eli Dugan was seen, he said when she came in. South of town this afternoon, 2 riders with him. She stayed calm, or she made the external presentation of calm, which she had learned was mostly the same thing. How close? Close enough that he's thinking about it. Colt turned from the window. It might be nothing. Might be he's looking for the best route out of the territory, and we're between him and where he's going. But I want you to know, because I should be careful. Because tomorrow's your last day, and I don't want you walking around not knowing the situation. All right, she said. She sat down in one of the accumulated chairs, because standing felt like performing steadiness, and she was too tired for performance. What are you going to do? I've already put word to the other riders. We'll have eyes on the road tonight. He paused. I also want someone outside the schoolhouse tomorrow. You mean you? Or one of the association riders? Someone. She looked at him standing in the lamplight of the sitting room, in his sweat-worn clothes with the bandaged arm and the alert eyes, and she thought about the fact that Eli Dugan existed and might be thinking about something south of this town, and underneath that thought was another one. Tomorrow is the last day. The day after that, the coach comes. Colt, she said, How long have you been writing for the association? He seemed slightly surprised by the change of direction. Going on 6 years? And before that, what did you do? When you first came west? Ranch work, mostly cattle, some guiding. He came and sat down across from her, which was unusual. He typically stayed standing in rooms near the door, where he could see all of it. The sitting down was a concession of some kind. Why? I'm trying to understand this place, she said. And I think to understand it, I need to understand the people who chose it. I didn't exactly choose it, he said. It was more He thought about it. I kept moving west, and eventually I ran out of west, and this was where I was. And then you stayed. And then I stayed. He turned his hat in his hands, the gesture she had come to recognize as his version of thinking something through. It needed staying. What does that mean? Means there were people here who couldn't leave even if things were bad. Families, Alderman, Doc Yates, Mabel. A pause. The kids. He shrugged, the small, uncomfortable shrug of someone touching something they don't usually talk about. Somebody had to watch the road for them. And nobody else was doing it. Nobody else was doing it, he agreed. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night had settled fully over Red Mesa Crossing, and the fiddle had started up again from somewhere down the street. She had not asked who played it, and now she found herself wondering if it mattered, or if some things were better appreciated without the explanation. What happened in Missouri? She asked. The different life. He was still for a second. My father's farm, he said. There was a drought. We lost it. A pause that had weight in it. Then there wasn't much to stay for. How old were you? 16. She did the arithmetic again and then stopped doing it, because it wasn't helpful and she knew it and she was going to stop. That's a lot to carry at 16, she said. You get used to what you carry, he said. Not dismissively, just accurately. Do you? She said. Or do you just stop noticing its weight? He looked at her in the lamplight for a moment. The question had landed somewhere it wasn't entirely expected, and she could see him feeling around its edges. That's a different question than I've been asking myself, he said. I know, she said. I've been asking myself a version of it for a while. The answer's uncomfortable. Yeah, he said. I expect it is. They sat in the sitting room while the night went on around them, and the fiddle played its slow tune, and neither of them said the things that were accumulating in the space between the chairs. Some of it was because the things weren't fully formed yet. Some of it was because the coach came the day after tomorrow. And what was the point? Evelyn went upstairs at 9 o'clock. She lay in the narrow bed in room 4 and listened to the sounds of the settlement going to sleep, the fiddle stopping, a horse shifting in the livery, Mabel moving around downstairs in her predictable evening rounds. And she thought about Sadie's face when she said people always leave, and Marcus getting the second problem right, and the way Colt had sat down in the sitting room rather than standing, and she fell asleep before she had sorted out what any of it meant. The last day of school was a Friday. She did not plan what she said at the end of it. That was unusual for her. She was a planner, or had been, in her previous life, in her carefully managed previous life, but the afternoon ran long, and the light was getting gold through the east windows, even at the wrong angle by the time she ran out of lesson, and she looked at the 17 faces arranged in front of her, and she simply talked. She told them what she had told Sadie one-on-one, but larger. She told them that the frontier was not a sentence, that where they were was not the limit of where they might go, but it was also not a starting deficiency. It was just a starting point, like any other, and what they did from it was not fixed. She told Marcus, in front of everyone, that his arithmetic mind was a real and useful thing. She told Clara that her doll was welcome back any day, and that being 5 was not a problem, but a beginning. She told Tom and Billy separately that their particular variety of chaos would serve them well in a decade or so if they could learn to direct it. She told Sadie last because Sadie she was saving. You are going to be a teacher yourself someday. I'm not guessing, I'm observing. The girl looked at her lap. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, but her face was still, which was an act of self-command in a 9-year-old that Evelyn found more moving than she was prepared for. After the children left, Evelyn stood in the empty classroom for a long time. She cleaned the blackboard completely, all the ghost lesson chalk dust included. She put the primer back exactly where she found it. She straightened the desks. She stood in the door and looked at the room. Tomorrow the coach came. She put out the lamp and went back to the hotel. And she did not look back at the schoolhouse, because some acts of self-preservation are that simple and that necessary, and she knew herself well enough to know what looking back would cost her. Colt was not in the dining room when she came in. He was not in the sitting room either. Mabel, bringing coffee to the one other guest in the dining room, told her without being asked that he was out on a night ride, checking the South Road, and that he had said he'd be back before morning. Evelyn sat at the window table with her coffee and the sounds of the settlement around her, and she was aware, in the way you are aware of a tooth before it starts actually hurting, of something beginning in her chest that she was not sure she had the architecture to handle. She had come here broken and heading west, and grateful simply to be alive. That had been 3 days ago. 3 days was nothing. 3 days was not enough time for anything to take root. She drank her coffee and was very firm with herself about this. And the firmness lasted until she went upstairs and the night was very quiet. And then it did not last particularly well at all. He came back before dawn. She knew because she heard the gray horse in the livery. She had learned the sound of it over 3 days without meaning to. The particular rhythm of those hooves on hard ground, slightly heavier on the left fore from the way Colt sat in the saddle. She lay in the narrow bed in room 4 and listened to it and did not get up, because getting up would mean something she wasn't prepared to mean yet. She had slept badly. Not from fear. The night had been quiet, no sign of Eli Dugan, no sounds from the South Road that weren't wind and the occasional dog. She had slept badly because her mind would not stop doing the thing minds do when they are confronted with a decision they haven't officially admitted is a decision yet. It kept running the same circuit. The coach came tomorrow morning. Ruth was expecting her in Yuma. She had a plan, modest and imperfect as it was, and the plan was to keep moving west and find her footing in a place where no one knew her name or what she'd failed at. That was the sensible thing. That had been the sensible thing for 3 weeks of planning and 35 years of being a person who did the sensible thing. The sensible thing had given her 9 years in a house that felt like a coat belonging to someone else. She got up at 5:30, dressed in the dark by feel, pinned her hair without looking in the glass, went downstairs. Colt was at the window table. He had coffee and the look of a man who has been riding in the cold dark and has not yet fully come back to being indoors. There was dust on his jacket, and his hat was on the table beside him, and his hair was doing what hair does after hours under a hat in the wind. He looked, she thought, very tired and very real in a way that people in cities rarely manage to look, where there was always enough comfort available to smooth the edges off. He glanced up when she came down the stairs. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She went to the kitchen pass-through and found the coffee pot and poured a cup without asking, because by now that was simply how the hotel worked for her. She came and sat across from him. "Anything?" "No sign of them," he said, checked the South Road to the canyon and came back on the Eastern Trail. "Nothing." "So they've moved on." "Maybe. Or they're waiting for morning." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I think they've moved on. The territory marshal sent 2 men from the South Station 2 days ago. Dugan's smart enough to know when the odds have shifted." "You don't sound entirely convinced." "I'm never entirely convinced," he said. "That's what's kept me alive." Evelyn looked at him across the table in the thin early light. It was the light before sunrise, gray and honest, before the desert heat had climbed into the air and changed the quality of everything. In it, Colt looked his exact age, not younger, not older. And she thought that this might be the last time she had the opportunity to look at him in this particular light, in this particular way. She did not say that. She drank her coffee. "The children were good," she said instead. "Yesterday. Sadie told me." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "She came to find me at the livery when school let out. Said you told her she'd be a teacher." "I meant it." "I know you did." He paused. "She believed you. That's rarer than you'd think out here. Adults telling kids something real and meaning it." "People should say real things to children," Evelyn said. "They already know when you're not." "They already know," he agreed. He looked at his coffee cup. "Marcus find you after?" "No." "Should he have?" Colt made a small sound that might have been a laugh under other circumstances. "He came to the livery too. Wouldn't say what he wanted for about 10 minutes. Then he asked me if I thought arithmetic was a useful skill for a man." Evelyn set her cup down. "What did you tell him?" "Told him it depended on what the man wanted to do with his life, but that in my experience, Men who could calculate things that other men couldn't were never without work. Good answer. He seemed to think so. A pause. He asked if I knew of anyone who'd want to teach him more of it. Something tightened in Evelyn's chest. And what did you say? Colt looked at her directly. In the gray morning light, his eyes were more gray than green, and very steady. I told him I didn't know yet, he said. The sentence sat between them. Evelyn was the first to look away. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and put it back down. And there was a long moment where the only sounds were the livery coming awake across the street, and somewhere the first bird of the morning making its territorial announcement to the empty air. Colt, she said. I know, he said. I wasn't going to say, I know what you were going to say. He turned his hat in his hands. You were going to say something sensible, about your sister, about the plan. It is sensible. Yeah. He didn't argue with it. That was the difficult thing. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't pressuring. He was just sitting there with his hat in his hands being honest, which she found considerably harder to manage than argument would have been. I know it is. I've been here 3 days, she said. 3 days, he agreed. That's not... She stopped. Started again. A person doesn't make decisions based on 3 days. Some people do, he said quietly. Some decisions don't wait for a person to be ready. That's not a good way to make decisions. No, he agreed again. It's not. He put his hat on the table. I'm not asking you to make any decision, Evelyn. I want you to know that. I'm not going to be the reason you do something that later looks foolish to you. She wanted to tell him that was a very noble position and also quite annoying, but she kept that to herself. Then what are you saying? She said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm saying that this place, the school, the kids, Mabel, the association, it's not nothing. It's not perfect, and it's not easy, and winter out here is a genuine trial, but it's not nothing. He looked out the window at the main street coming pale in the early light. And I think you know that, because you'd have slept better if you didn't. She stared at him. I heard you walking around up there, he said, without any particular triumph in it. Not last night, the night before too. The floor makes noise, she said. It does, he agreed with complete equanimity. She pushed back from the table and went to stand at the window, because she needed to be somewhere other than directly across from him for a moment. The main street of Red Mesa Crossing was coming awake in the particular way of small settlements. Slowly and completely, no intermediate stage between sleeping and working. Alderman's store was lit already, his lamp visible through the window. Doc Yates's office was dark. The schoolhouse was a plain shape down the street, and she could see the door from here. She had cleaned that blackboard and straightened those desks and left everything in order for whoever came next. My sister is expecting me, she said to the window. I know. She's been asking me to come for 2 years. I know that too. If I don't come now... You can write her a letter, Colt said. She can write you back. You're both still alive and capable of correspondence. It's not the same as being there, but it's not the end either. Evelyn pressed her palm flat against the window glass, the same gesture she had made on the coach coming in when she had seen the children running alongside. The glass was cool from the night. You make it sound simple, she said. It's not simple, he said. I know it's not simple. A pause. I'm not trying to make it sound like it is. She turned around. He was watching her from the table with that particular attention of his, not demanding, not pleading, just present in the way he was always present, completely and without pretense. It occurred to her that she had met approximately no one in her previous life who was present in that way. People in Philadelphia were always partly elsewhere, planning, performing, managing how they appeared. Colt Mercer was here, just here, in this room, in this conversation with her. What do you want? She said. He seemed slightly surprised by the directness of it, which was fair because she was slightly surprised too. You're asking me. I'm asking you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said simply, I want you to stay. 3 words. No embellishment, no strategy behind it, no careful angle, sorry, just the thing itself, said plainly in the gray morning before the sun had come up. Why? She said, because she needed to hear it more completely than that, even if she wasn't sure she was going to believe it once she had. Because the school needs someone, he said. Because Sadie needs someone. Because this town has been holding itself together on stubbornness and goodwill for long enough that it deserves better than that. He stopped. Then, more quietly, and because Another stop. He pressed his lips together briefly, and she could see him doing the same internal negotiation she had been doing all night. The war between the thing that is honest and the thing that is safe. Because I haven't wanted to ask someone to stay before, he said. And I'm asking. The silence after it was very full. Outside, the sun was finally beginning to edge over the horizon, and the light changed. That immediate transformation of the desert at sunrise, gray to gold to something almost violent in its color. It came through the window behind her and crossed the floor and reached the table where Colt was sitting, and he didn't move, just let it arrive. Evelyn looked at him in the new light. 35 years old and twice as careful as she'd been at 26, and still standing in the same place she'd always been, on the edge of something that logic said was reckless, and something deeper said was the first honest thing she'd had the option to choose in a very long time. I need to think, she said. All right, he said. He picked up his hat. He stood up from the table without pressure, without the particular male impatience she had learned to read in 9 years of marriage as the silent version of "you're taking too long." He just stood up, and his face was quiet, and he said, "The coach comes at 8. She knew what time the coach came. She had been counting the hours since yesterday. He put his hat on and went out, and the door swung behind him, and Evelyn stood at the window in the new gold morning and did not move for a long time. Mabel found her there 10 minutes later, which Evelyn suspected was not accidental. The older woman came from the kitchen with a plate of biscuits that she set on the table near the window, and then she stood for a moment assessing the situation with the frank, unsentimentally calibrated eye of someone who has watched enough people be at crossroads to recognize the view. "You want to tell me to mind my business," Mabel said. "That's fine." "I wasn't going to say that," Evelyn said. "Most people think it." "I don't have enough information to make decisions in isolation," Evelyn said, "and you know him better than I do." She came back to the table and sat down. "How long?" Mabel sat across from her with the ease of a woman who was not going to pretend this was anything other than what it was. "Since he was 17, she said. "He rode in here with a busted saddle and a horse he'd traded 2 weeks' work for. Got a room, did some work for aldermen, got more work, stayed." She poured herself coffee from the pot on the table with the ease of someone in their own house, which she was. "He's not a man who talks much about what's inside him." "I expect you've noticed that." "I've noticed. What you might not have noticed, because you haven't been here long enough, is that he doesn't talk about it, and he still does it, every time." Mabel wrapped her hands around her cup. "He wrote Purvis's mother a letter without being asked. He checks on the Reardon family every week since Jim Reardon broke his leg, brings firewood, sees that the cattle are watered. He was the one who sat with Doc Yates last winter when Yates's wife was dying. Just sat there for 3 nights because Yates shouldn't have been alone and nobody else thought to stay." She paused. "He doesn't announce any of it." Evelyn was quiet. "Now," Mabel continued, "I'm not telling you to stay. That's your business and your life, and the frontier is genuinely difficult in ways that a person from Philadelphia might not have the full picture of. Winter is a serious trial. The work is physical. The isolation is real." She picked up her coffee. "What I'm telling you is that when Colt Mercer thinks something is worth his attention, he is consistent about it in a way that most men are not. And he has been paying attention to you since the minute you told him about Purvis at Doc Yates's office." "He asked me to stay," Evelyn said. Mabel's expression did not change. "I know," she said. "He told me he was going to, last night before he rode out." "He told you?" "He doesn't talk much about what's inside him," Mabel said, "but he tells me what he's going to do when it matters." Something moved in her face, not sentimental but warm in the way of old attachment. "He hasn't asked anyone to stay before. Not in 10 years I've known him." Evelyn pressed her hands flat on the table. The biscuits were in front of her and she hadn't touched them, and she recognized distantly that she had not eaten anything, and the coach came at 8 and it was currently somewhere around 6:15. "What would staying look like?" she said. Not to Mabel exactly. Out loud, to herself, to the room. "That's the practical question," Mabel said approvingly. And it's a good one. She set her cup down. The school salary is $30 a month, room included in the schoolhouse quarters. Small, but private. Alderman's been authorized by the town council to offer it. She paused. I may have had a conversation with Alderman 2 days ago. Evelyn looked at her. You were useful on day one, Mabel said, unapologetically. I'm practical about these things. Does everyone in this town? Yes, Mabel said. Essentially. She stood and smoothed her apron. The biscuits are fresh. You should eat something before the coach comes and you have to decide which direction you're getting on it. She went back to the kitchen. Evelyn sat alone at the window table with the new morning light and the biscuits and a problem she had been trying to solve by turning it into a logic exercise, and which was not, she was increasingly aware, the kind of problem that logic solved. She went to find Doc Yates at 7. He was in his office, already seeing a patient. She could hear voices through the closed door. So she waited on the bench outside in the morning sun and watched the main street come fully alive. Alderman's boy was sweeping the store porch. 2 horses were being watered at the trough near the livery. A woman she hadn't met came out of a house at the far end of the street, looked at the sky, and went back in. The ordinary machinery of a small place turning over into another day. Yates came out after 10 minutes, looked at her sitting on the bench, and said without preamble, You're not injured. No, she said. I have a question. He sat on the far end of the bench with the boneless ease of a man who has learned to rest any time the opportunity presents itself. Ask it. What's this town going to be in 10 years? She said. He looked at her. That's an unusual question. I'm trying to think clearly about something and I keep thinking about the wrong part of it, she said. I know what I feel. What I don't know is whether what I feel is responding to something real or to 3 days of unusual circumstances that would fade as soon as the circumstances became ordinary. Yates considered this with the seriousness it deserved. In 10 years, he said, if the railroad comes through, and there's real talk of it, have been for 2 years, this is going to be a town of 500, maybe more. If it doesn't come through, it stays what it is, which is small and functional and isolated. He paused. Either way, the children who are here now are going to be the ones running it. And right now those children are getting patched together schooling at best. He looked down the street. What I think you're really asking is whether there's a future here, and I think yes. But it's the kind of future that requires people who are willing to build it rather than wait for it to arrive already made. That's a diplomatic answer, she said. I'm a practical man, he said. The diplomatic part is incidental. He looked at her directly. You want my opinion on the other matter? She didn't deny it. I'm not going to give it, he said. You don't need another person's opinion on the other matter. You need your own. He stood, pressed his hands briefly to his lower back in the manner of a man whose back has opinions of its own. What I will tell you is that Colt Mercer is the most reliable person in this settlement, and possibly the most genuinely decent one, which is different from the most outwardly impressive one. And you've already noticed that, or you wouldn't be sitting on my bench at 7 in the morning. He went to the door of his office. The coach comes at 8. You've got time to finish thinking if you stop talking to people and actually do it. He went inside. She sat on the bench in the morning sun for a few minutes. A dog came and investigated her boots and then moved on. The fiddle player, she had finally learned it was the man at the far end of the street, a former cattle driver who'd broken his leg 2 years ago and taken it up to fill the time, was sitting on his porch and playing something slow and entirely without self-consciousness, just the sound going up into the morning air and dissipating. She thought about Richard, who had found her work embarrassing. She thought about 9 years of careful management and what it had produced, which was $63 in a coat lining and a trunk on a westbound stage. She thought about Philadelphia and the life that was there waiting to be rebuilt, the same life in a different house with a different arrangement. She thought about Sadie's face when she said people always leave. She thought about Marcus getting the second problem right. She thought about this gray morning and Colt's voice saying, I want you to stay, without strategy, without embellishment, just the plain thing. She thought about the schoolroom with the ghost lesson board and the rawhide repaired dictionary and the wedge under the desk leg, and how she had walked into it and felt immediately that she was somewhere she was supposed to be, which was a feeling she had not had since she was 29 years old and standing in a classroom in Philadelphia telling 30 children about the American Revolution. She stood up from the bench. Her trunk was in the hotel, already packed. She had done it last night, before she went to bed, with the mechanical efficiency of someone preparing for the obvious next step. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. $63 in the coat lining. Her whole new beginning. She opened the trunk and took out the coat and unpicked 4 stitches from the inner seam and counted out $30 and repinned the remaining $33. $30 would see her through the first month if the council's offer was real, which Mabel's involvement made her fairly confident it was. 33 was a margin. She was a woman who believed in margins. Then she sat on the bed and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Ruth. She wrote 3 drafts of it, the same number Colt had written of the letter to Purvis's mother, and the final version was honest in a way the first 2 weren't. She told Ruth that she had arrived at a stop on the way and that it had turned out not to be a stop. She told her that she was going to stay in Red Mesa Crossing and teach school and see what came of it, and she told her that she understood if Ruth was frustrated, and she hoped she would come and visit instead, because the country was genuinely extraordinary, and the people were real in a way she had been missing without knowing she was missing it. The second letter was to a woman named Agnes Cole in Philadelphia, who had run the teacher placement board for 20 years and would know who to contact about permanent Western positions for qualified teachers, because if Evelyn was going to stay, she was also going to make certain that what she had started held past her own tenure. She sealed both letters and put them in her reticule. Then she closed the trunk without repacking it, because she was going to need someone to carry it somewhere that was not the stage depot. And she was going to need to find out exactly what the schoolhouse quarters looked like. And she was going to need to have a conversation with Mayor Alderman that started with the words, "I understand there's a position." She took one breath in the small room in the hotel that had been hers for 3 nights and was nobody's in particular. Then she went downstairs. Bob. The dining room was empty except for Mabel, who took one look at Evelyn's face and went to get coffee without saying anything, which was exactly the right response. Evelyn sat at the window table. The clock on the wall said 7:40. 20 minutes to the coach. She drank her coffee and watched the street and let herself be still for the first time in 3 days. The decision was made. The strange thing about decisions that have been made is how quiet they become, after all the noise of the making. At 7:50, she saw Colt come out of the livery across the street. He had the gray horse with him, saddled, and he stood for a moment in the morning light, stroking the horse's nose and looking down the street toward the stage depot. His back was to her. From here, he was just a young man and a horse and the long shadow of an early morning, and she thought that this was the last image of him she might have had if the night had gone differently. If she had decided in the small hours that sensible was the same thing as right. She was out the door before she had consciously decided to move. The street was warm already, and the dust rose slightly around her shoes as she crossed it. Colt heard her coming. She suspected he heard most things before they arrived, and turned before she reached him. He looked at her face, and something in his went very careful and very still. "The coach comes in 10 minutes, he said. "I know," she said. He waited. "I went to see Doc Yates this morning," she said. "What did he say?" "He told me to stop talking to people and think." She stopped in front of him. The horse nosed her shoulder in a friendly, completely uninvited way. She ignored it. "I thought." "And?" She took the 2 letters from her reticule. "I need these sent. One to Yuma, one to Philadelphia." She held them out. "And I need to know if the offer from the town council is still on the table, because I intend to talk to Alderman in the next 20 minutes before I change my mind." Something happened to his face. It did not announce itself. It was not the dramatic transformation of someone performing joy, but it was real, and it arrived with the quality of something that had been waiting very patiently and was now allowed to be. "It's still on the table," he said quietly. "You knew this was going to happen," she said. Not as an accusation, as an observation. "No," he said without hesitation. "I hoped." A pause. "That's different." Down the street, she could hear the stage driver calling out arrival, the sound of horses and the mechanical noise of the coach braking, and under it the ordinary sounds of a settlement morning. Somewhere Sadie was at home with her mother. Marcus was wherever 14-year-old boys were at 7:50 in the morning. The fiddle player was on his porch. "I'm going to be terrible at this," she said. "The frontier, the winter, all of it." "Probably," he agreed, "for a while." "That's not very reassuring." You didn't ask to be reassured, he said. You asked for honesty. She looked at him in the morning light, this man who did not announce his decency, who wrote letters on the fourth draft and checked back trails automatically, and had sat with a dying woman because her husband shouldn't be alone, who had said, I want you to stay with no performance and no strategy, and trusted her with the plainness of it. All right, she said. All right, he said back. The stage rattled past them down the main street, raising its cloud of dust, not stopping, continuing west toward Yuma. She watched it go without the feeling she had expected to feel, which would have been loss. What she felt instead was the particular settling of a person who has been leaning forward into a wind for a long time and has finally turned out of it. Colt took the letters from her hand. His fingers were rough from rope and reins and the work of the desert. His hand around hers was brief and uncomplicated and warm. I'll get these on the morning rider, he said. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, the same nod he had given her that very first morning over breakfast at Mabel's table. The nod that meant I've taken in this information and I'm treating it seriously. Then he turned to settle the gray horse back in the livery, because the horse needed settling and there was a morning to get on with. Evelyn turned toward Alderman's store, which was open and lit and ready for business, the way it was every morning, the way it would be tomorrow and the day after. Behind her, the last dust of the westbound coach settled back to the earth. She walked toward the store with the sun on her back, and $30 folded in her coat, and the particular feeling of a woman who has made an irreversible decision and is discovering, step by step, that irreversible is not the same as wrong. Alderman said yes to everything in under 5 minutes, which suggested to Evelyn that Mabel had done considerably more groundwork than she had admitted to, and that the town council of Red Mesa Crossing had been ready to make this offer before Evelyn had any idea she was going to accept it. She did not find this manipulative. She found it efficient, and she respected efficiency. The schoolhouse quarters turned out to be 2 small rooms attached to the back of the building, a sleeping room and a sitting room that doubled as a kitchen, with a cast-iron stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a window that faced west over the edge of the settlement and out into open desert. The furniture was sparse, and the walls were plain wood, and in winter the stove would need to run most of the night to keep the chill out. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the sleeping room and looked at the narrow bed and the single hook on the wall and thought that it was approximately the size of the dressing room in the Philadelphia house she had shared with Richard, which made it exactly the right size. It's not much, Alderman said beside her. It's mine, she said. He looked at her. Yes, ma'am, he said. It is. Her trunk came over from the hotel that afternoon, carried by Tom and Billy Reardon, who had somehow learned within 20 minutes of the decision being made that Mrs. Hartwell was staying, and had presented themselves at the hotel with the combined energy of 2 boys who need an excuse to be useful and have been handed one. They were not quiet about the carrying. They narrated the process extensively and with considerable inaccuracy about its difficulty. And Mabel watched them go with an expression that was 90% exasperation and 10% the kind of warmth that doesn't need to announce itself. Sadie came in the evening. She came alone, without the twins, which told Evelyn something about the nature of the visit. She stood in the doorway of the sitting room and looked at the stove and the table and the window, and her face was doing the careful thing again, the 9-year-old management of hope that comes from having had it disappointed before. You're really staying, she said. I'm really staying, Evelyn said. The girl came inside then. She sat in one of the 2 chairs with her back very straight and her hands in her lap. School starts again Monday? She asked. Monday, Evelyn confirmed. 8 o'clock. I'll tell the others. I'd appreciate that. Evelyn sat in the opposite chair. Sadie, look at me. The girl looked up. I'm not going to make you a promise I can't keep. Things change, but I intend to stay. This isn't a stop for me anymore. Sadie considered this with the seriousness it warranted. Then she nodded, once the same way Colt nodded, the gesture of someone who has received information and is placing it carefully where it belongs. Okay, she said. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and left, because 9-year-olds with good instincts know when a conversation has said what it needed to say. The first month was harder than Evelyn had expected in the ways she had anticipated, and harder in some ways she hadn't. She had expected the heat. It was already the kind of heat in late summer that changed the quality of thought. Thick, and pressing, making everything that required concentration require more of it. The schoolroom in the afternoon was an act of collective endurance, and she learned to do the hardest lessons in the morning and give the afternoons over to reading aloud, which required less of the children and which she could do well even when her own concentration was fraying at the edges from the temperature. She had expected the physical difficulty of the quarters, hauling water, managing the stove, the absence of the services she had taken for granted in the East. She had not expected how quickly she got competent at these things, or how competent she already was, from 9 years of managing a household that Richard had preferred she manage without help to reduce the social inconvenience of servants. What she had not expected was the particular quality of frontier loneliness. It was different from city loneliness. City loneliness was being alone in a crowd, surrounded by indifference. Frontier loneliness was the specific weight of distances. The nearest city 3 days by coach, the nearest women's society meeting a concept from another world. The evenings long and quiet in a way that Philadelphia evenings never were, because Philadelphia evenings always had noise, even when you didn't want it. She wrote to Ruth. She wrote to Agnes Cole about teacher placement. She read. She prepared lessons. She went to Mabel's in the evening sometimes and sat in the sitting room while Mabel sewed, and they talked about things that were not particularly important and found each other's company adequate, which was better than adequate, which Evelyn came to understand was high praise in Mabel's accounting. And Colt was there, not constantly. He wrote out regularly on association business, sometimes for 2 or 3 days at a stretch, but in the consistent background way he had been there since the first morning. He appeared at the schoolhouse occasionally to fix things, which the schoolhouse reliably needed. A window board that had worked loose, a step on the porch that had begun to give, the stove's flue pipe that needed cleaning before fall. He did these things without being asked, which should have been presumptuous and wasn't, because he always knocked first and he never came inside without an invitation. And when the job was done, he left without making a production of the leaving. They ate together at Mabel's twice a week, usually. Sometimes 3 times. The first time he stayed to help her carry something back to the schoolhouse quarters after dinner. They stood in the street in the dark for a moment before she went in, and the particular quality of that moment, what it was and what it was becoming, and what neither of them had named yet, was present between them as clearly as if it had taken a physical shape. "You're settling in," he said. Not a question. "I'm trying," she said. "Some days better than others. That's how it goes." "Colt." She looked at him in the dark. "What we're doing, whatever this is, I need it to move slowly. I know that might be frustrating." He looked at her with the steadiness she had come to rely on. "It's not frustrating," he said. "You're sure?" "I've been patient about most things in my life," he said. "I can be patient about this one." A pause. "I'd rather have it slow and real than fast and not." She thought about Richard, who had been interested in fast courtship, fast marriage, fast arrival at the stable life he'd wanted. What he had not been interested in was the slow, actual work of knowing another person. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and went home. And she went inside, and the night was very quiet and wide over the desert. The letter from Ruth arrived in the 3rd week. It was long, which was Ruth's way, and it moved through several emotional registers. Initial hurt, which Ruth was honest enough to name and then put down. Genuine curiosity, which was Ruth's dominant mode. And a tentative approval that Ruth wrapped in enough qualifications to maintain her position as the practical sister, but which was there if you knew how to read her. "I want to come and see this place," she wrote near the end. "I want to meet the children you wrote about, and this man you were very careful not to describe in too much detail, which tells me more than a description would have. I want to see what kind of frontier makes my sister turn down a westbound coach. I'll plan for spring, if the road is manageable." Evelyn read this paragraph twice. Then she put the letter in the drawer of the sitting room table and went to teach arithmetic. The letter from Agnes Cole arrived 2 weeks after that. Agnes had located 3 trained teachers currently in St. Louis and looking for Western positions. 2 women and 1 man, all with references she described as solid. She included their names and a brief note on each. One of the women, a Miss Theodora Banks, 28, formerly of the Boston school system, had written in her application that she was specifically interested in frontier postings, that she had family in the territory, and that she considered the work of building schools and new settlements to be the most important educational work available. Evelyn wrote back to Agnes immediately, requesting that Miss Banks be put in contact with Mayor Alderman of Red Mesa Crossing. Then she wrote to Alderman himself, explaining what she had done and why. Then, because she was thorough, she wrote a brief note to Miss Banks directly, describing the school and the settlement honestly. The difficulty, and the heat, and the isolation, the patched-together nature of current resources, and also the 17 children who came reliably every morning, and the boy with the arithmetic mind and the girl who would be a teacher herself someday. She did not write about herself in the letter. Miss Banks didn't need that part of the story. What she needed was the truth about the place, so she could decide with clear eyes. Alderman came to find her the day he received his copy of her correspondence. He stood in the doorway of the schoolroom at the end of the school day, hat in hand, and looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his version of being moved. "You're looking for your own replacement," he said. "I'm looking for the school's future," she said, "which is different." "You planning on leaving?" "No," she said. "But I'm one person. One person is always a risk. The school needs 2 teachers eventually when the enrollment grows. If the railroad comes through." "When?" Alderman said. He said it with a conviction that surprised her. "It's when. We got word last week. Survey teams coming through in spring." She looked at him. 500 people in 2 years, he said. "Maybe more." He turned his hat in his hands. "We're going to need more than 2 teachers, Mrs. Hartwell." She sat down at the teacher's desk and felt the settling of that information, what it meant for the school, for the children, for the settlement itself, what it meant for the life she was building here, piece by piece, in the small, unglamorous way that lives are actually built. "Then we'd better start planning," she said. Alderman sat in the chair nearest the door, and for the next hour, they talked about what a proper school in Red Mesa Crossing would require, and Evelyn took notes on the back of a spelling test, and outside the afternoon sun moved across the schoolroom floor, and the dust floated in the bars of light, and the settlement went about its ordinary business. The trouble with Eli Dugan came in the 6th week. It did not come the way she had feared it would, not in the night, not with rifles. It came on a Tuesday afternoon when she was walking back from Alderman's store with a box of chalk and a new reader that had arrived on the weekly supply wagon. She was on the main street, 20 yards from the schoolhouse door, when a man stepped out of the narrow alley between the livery and the hardware store. She knew who he was before she had consciously processed why. The flat, calculating eyes. The particular stillness of a man who is deciding something rather than just standing somewhere. Eli Dugan was not his brother. His brother had been the kind of outlaw who relies on numbers and noise. This man was quieter than that, and quieter was worse. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. He said it the way you say a name when you've spent time learning it. "You've been here a while." She did not run. Running was the one thing she was certain would be wrong. She kept her hands visible and her voice level, and she said, "I live here." "Is that right?" He looked at her with the assessing patience of someone in no hurry. "Colt Mercer, too." "He rides for the association," she said. "He's out today." She did not know if this was true. She said it anyway. Dugan's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "I know," he said. "I know where he is." Her heart was doing something complicated and rapid that she was working very hard not to let arrive in her face. "What is it you want?" she said. "Information," he said. "That's all? When does he usually ride back in?" "I don't know his schedule," she said, which was true. "But you'd know more than most." "I'd know less than you think," she said. "He doesn't tell me his routes." Also true, also deliberate on Colt's part, she now understood. Dugan looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze because looking away felt like a concession she couldn't afford. Somewhere down the street she could hear the ordinary sounds of the settlement. A door, a horse, 2 women's voices. And she thought about how a person can be in terrible danger and the world around them can simply continue being ordinary, and it is somehow more frightening than if the world responded. "You're not scared," Dugan said. He said it with a faint curiosity. "I'm terrified," she said. "But that's not the same thing as being useful to you scared, so it doesn't seem worth showing." Something in his face shifted. Not warmth. The man was not warm, but something that might have been a grudging recognition. "Tell Mercer I said hello," he said, and then he walked back into the alley and was gone. She stood on the main street for another 30 seconds before she moved because her legs were not entirely reliable and she needed to establish that they were going to be before she asked them to carry her. Then she walked to the schoolhouse, set the box of chalk on the teacher's desk, sat down in the teacher's chair, and pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed. Then she got up, walked back out, and went to find Marcus. He was where she expected, at the livery, doing the work he did for Alderman's brother-in-law 3 afternoons a week. She told him what had happened, clearly and without embellishment, and told him to get word to whoever in town would know how to reach Colt on the South Trail. Marcus was gone before she finished the sentence. She went back to the schoolhouse and prepared tomorrow's arithmetic lesson, because there was nothing else she could usefully do, and being useless was something she had determined a long time ago to avoid. Colt came back at dusk, which was 2 hours earlier than his usual time on a South Trail day. He came to the schoolhouse quarters directly. He knocked, which he always did. She opened the door and he looked at her face, and his jaw went tight in the way she recognized. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. She told him. All of it, in order, as accurately as she could reconstruct. She had been going over it for the past 3 hours, so she had it clearly. What Dugan had said, where he'd been standing, what direction he'd gone after. When she finished, Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You looked him in the eye the whole time." "I thought it was better," she said. "It was," he said. "It was exactly right." He pressed his lips together briefly. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. Then, "I'll be fine." He noticed the distinction. She could see him notice it. He didn't push at it, which she was grateful for. "I'm going to have to ride out tonight," he said, "with 2 other riders. We need to find where he's camped." "I know." "Evelyn." He said her name with a weight that was not its usual weight. "What you did today, keeping your head, getting word out through Marcus, that mattered. It wasn't nothing." She looked at him in the doorway, in the last light of the evening. He had ridden hard getting back, and he was tired, and she could see in his face the specific kind of worn that comes from having been scared about something and not being able to show it while the being scared was happening. "Colt," she said carefully, "were you frightened when you got the word?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I was." It was such a plain answer. No performance around it, no masculine architecture built to make it sound like something other than what it was. She stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw, which she had not planned to do, and which was the most forward thing she had done in recent memory. His face went very still under her hand, and then he turned his head slightly, just slightly, into it. "Come back safe," she said. He put his hand over hers briefly. "Plan to," he said. Then he went, because there was a thing that needed doing, and he was the one to do it, and that was simply the nature of who he was. She closed the door of the sitting room and stood in it alone and was aware, completely and without any remaining capacity for self-deception, that she loved him. Not the frontier drama version of love, not the heat of the past weeks and the proximity and the unusual circumstances. She loved him in the specific, inconvenient, irrevocable way that comes from watching a person do hard things honestly over a long enough time that you stop being able to explain it away as anything else. She sat down and picked up the arithmetic lesson plan and worked on it until the lamp oil ran low. But they brought Eli Dugan in the following morning, Colt and 2 riders named Jarvis and Chen, who had been riding for the association 3 years and who Evelyn met for the first time when they came down the main street at 7:15 with Dugan between them in cuffs. The territory marshal was already on his way from the South Station, word having been sent the day before. There was no drama in it. That was the thing that struck her, how undramatic the actual resolution of a dangerous situation was when it finally arrived. Dugan was put in the room at the back of Alderman's store that served as a holding cell, and the association riders went to the hotel for breakfast, and the children came to school at 8 o'clock, and the day proceeded. She was halfway through the morning's reading lesson when she heard Colt's boots on the schoolhouse porch. She kept teaching. He waited outside, which she could see through the window. Leaning against the porch rail, looking out at the street, his hat in his hand. The children noticed him, but she did not invite the distraction. Marcus at the back noticed where she was not looking and had the sense to say nothing. At the noon break, she went out. Colt was still at the rail. He was in the state she recognized as post-action. Not exactly tired, but emptied out. The particular flatness of someone who has been very alert for a very long time and has just been allowed to stop. "Done?" she said. "Done," he said. "Marshall takes him to Tucson this afternoon." "And it holds?" "The testimony from the first robbery is solid. Between that and yesterday," he shook his head. "It holds." She leaned against the rail beside him. The noon sun was direct and serious, the kind that made you aware of your own shadow and grateful for any hat brim. She was aware of his shoulder 4 inches from hers and the quality of the quiet between them, which was different from earlier quiets. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right." She looked out at the main street rather than at him, because some things are easier said to the middle distance. "When you rode out last night, I understood something about myself that I'd been working around for about 6 weeks. He waited. "I love you," she said. She said it the way he said things, plainly, without embellishment, just the thing itself. "That's not a request for anything. I'm not asking you to respond to it in any particular way. I'm telling you because I think honesty between people matters more than strategy, and I've spent too many years being strategic about things that deserve to be honest." The silence afterward had a texture. She did not fill it. "Evelyn," he said, "you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." He turned from the rail and looked at her, and his face was doing the thing it had done that gray morning when she'd said she'd stay. Not performed, not announced, just real and careful and completely present. "I loved you before I asked you to stay," he said. "I didn't say so because I didn't think it was fair to say it when I was asking you for something. I didn't want it to be leverage." She looked at him. "That's the most complicated form of honesty I've ever encountered." "Yeah," he said. "I've been told I overthink." "You were 17 when you came here," she said. "You've had a long time to develop habits." Something crossed his face. That almost smile, the one she had catalogued in the first minutes of knowing him, and which had been rearranging itself into something fuller in the weeks since. "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation," she said. "I'm a teacher. I observe things." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do about it?" "About which part?" "All of it." She thought about it seriously, which he deserved. She thought about 6 weeks of slow building and the way a person's life shifts under them when they stop fighting it and starts feeling something new beneath the foundation. "I want to keep doing what we're doing," she said, "and let it be what it is, not push it into a shape it hasn't grown into yet." "That sounds right to me," he said. "It should," she said. "It's sensible." "You and you're sensible," he said, and this time the smile made it all the way up, and she felt it in her chest in the specific way that she was going to have to get used to. "Some of us have had to develop the habit," she said. The children were coming back from the yard. She could hear Tom and Billy before she could see them, which was always how it was with Tom and Billy. Sadie was with them, walking more quietly, and she glanced at the porch as she came up the step and took in the two of them standing there, and her expression went carefully neutral in the particular way of a 9-year-old who has registered something and is deciding to let the adults handle it. "Lunch is done," Sadie reported. "Thank you, Sadie," Evelyn said. "Tell everyone we'll start in 5 minutes." The girl went inside. Tom and Billy went inside with the energy of small disasters. The schoolroom noise started up. Evelyn turned from the rail. "I have to teach," she said. "I know," Colt said. "Tonight," she said. "Mabel's. Dinner." "I'll be there," he said. She went back into the schoolroom. 23 children. Enrollment had gone up in the past 2 weeks. Families from the outlying ranches sending children in on wagons were arranged in various states of readiness for the afternoon. Clara had her doll on the desk. Marcus was in the back with his notebook open, which was where his notebook now lived, full of problems he had asked Evelyn to give him that went beyond the day's lesson. She picked up the chalk. "All right," she said. "This afternoon we're going to work on geography. Specifically," she wrote on the board, "the territories of the American West, where they are, what's in them, and why any of it matters to the people who live in them." Sadie's hand went up before the last word was fully out. "Yes, Sadie." "Does it matter more when you've chosen to be here?" the girl said. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. The question had arrived from somewhere real. Not a child performing cleverness, but a child actually asking something she wanted to know the answer to. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I think it matters considerably more." She turned back to the board and began drawing a map, the territories taking shape in chalk, and the afternoon light came through the east windows at its long slant, and the 23 children bent over their desks, and the schoolroom of Red Mesa Crossing was alive with the particular noise of people learning things they did not know the day before. Outside, the main street went about its business. Down at the far end, the fiddle player was at his porch. The supply wagon was being unloaded at Alderman's. 2 women were talking in front of the hardware store with the ease of women who have known each other long enough to talk without performing. In the holding room at the back of Alderman's store, Eli Dugan waited for the marshal from Tucson, and Colt Mercer went back to the livery and tended to the gray horse and was, for the first time in a long time, not checking the back trail. Winter came to Red Mesa Crossing in early November, which was later than Evelyn had been told to expect and harder than she had been told to prepare for, and she had been told to prepare for something fairly serious. The stove in the schoolhouse quarters ran from 4 in the morning until midnight, and still there were nights when she woke at 3 to find the room cold enough to see her breath. She had not owned a pair of proper work gloves in Philadelphia. She owned 2 pairs now, and neither of them was adequate. And she had written to Ruth asking her to send a 3rd pair of the heaviest weight available in Yuma. Ruth had sent 3 pairs and a wool blanket and a letter that said, among other things, "I still cannot entirely believe you stayed, and I am increasingly glad you did, which is the most confusing thing I have felt in recent years." The children came to school through the cold without complaint, which said something about them and also about their parents, who had decided collectively that education was worth the cold walk. Enrollment had reached 27 by December, which meant the 2 long benches were full, and Alderman had provided a 3rd. Evelyn had rearranged the room 3 times to make it work, and had finally arrived at an arrangement that was functional, if not particularly graceful, with the older children at the back and the younger ones at the front, where she could reach them more easily. Miss Theodora Banks wrote in December to say she had accepted Mayor Alderman's offer and would arrive in March when the roads were reliable again. The letter was direct and practical, and contained one sentence near the end that made Evelyn read it twice. "I understand from your note that the school is a project in progress, rather than an established institution, and I want you to know that this is exactly what I hope to find, because institutions are built by people willing to stay when staying is inconvenient, and I intend to be one of those people." Evelyn pinned the letter to the wall above the teacher's desk, where she could see it. Marcus, by December, was working through a mathematics primer designed for students 3 years his senior. He had stopped doing it secretly, had stopped somewhere around November the careful performance of indifference, and now worked on it openly at the back of the room with a focused concentration that occasionally unnerved the twins, who sat beside him and preferred a more social approach to academic endeavor. He had also, without being asked, started spending 20 minutes each morning helping the younger children with their letters before the official lesson began. He didn't announce this. He simply started doing it, which was a thing Evelyn had noticed about him. He was at his best when he thought no one was watching, and increasingly at his best when he knew they were. She told him this one afternoon in January, when the other children had gone, and he was stacking the slates along the wall. He went still for a moment, then continued stacking. "My father was like that," he said, "good at things when nobody was looking." "What happened to him?" she asked. She had pieced together some of it from things various people in the settlement had mentioned, but she had not asked directly before. "Fever, when I was 11. He set the last slate in the row. "My mother brought us here from Texas after. She said the East was full of his ghost, and she needed somewhere new." He paused. "I thought she was being dramatic." "And now?" He looked at the row of slates. "Now I think I understand it a little better," he said. What she meant. Evelyn did not say anything for a moment. Outside, the January wind was moving through the settlement with serious intent, the kind that found every gap in a building's construction and made its presence known. The stove was lit, and the room was warm in the particular way of rooms that are warm through effort rather than convenience, which she had come to find more comfortable than the other kind. "Marcus," she said, "I want to tell you something about what I see when I look at you. Not the arithmetic, though the arithmetic is real. Something else." He turned around, which cost him something. She could see it, the 14-year-old's reluctance to be seen clearly. "I see someone learning that it's safe to want things," she said. "That's a more important lesson than arithmetic. And it's one a lot of people never learn." He looked at the floor, then at the window, then at her. "How do you know I didn't know it before?" "Because you spent the first 2 days of school hiding in the back of the room," she said. "Which is what people do when they've learned that wanting and not getting is the worst option." He was quiet. The wind pressed at the building. "Yeah," he said finally. "I guess that's right." He put on his coat and hat and went out into the January cold, and Evelyn stayed to bank the stove, and she thought about 11-year-old boys losing their fathers to fever and how quietly enormous that was, how a thing like that becomes the hidden foundation of everything that comes after. Ruth came in March, 4 days before Theodora Banks arrived, which produced in Evelyn a scheduling anxiety she had not anticipated and which Mabel found quietly hilarious. Ruth Hartwell was 41 and looked more like their father than Evelyn did, and had lived in Arizona long enough to have the particular efficient practicality of someone who has been shaped by a place. She arrived on the westbound stage, the same route, the same company, a different driver since Briggs had retired in December. And when she stepped off and saw Evelyn standing in front of the hotel, she stopped and looked at her for a long moment before she said anything. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" Ruth tilted her head. "Less like someone waiting for something to end," she said. They ate at Mabel's that first night, the four of them, Evelyn, Ruth, Colt, and Mabel, who had been included without formal invitation and had arrived with a pie that she set on the table without comment. Ruth watched Colt with the frank assessment of an older sister who has been given a name and a letter and not much else, and Colt tolerated the assessment with a composure that might, in a smaller person, have been called patience, but in him was simply his ordinary way of being. "How long have you been writing for the association?" Ruth asked him, about 20 minutes into the meal. "Going on 7 years," he said. "And before that?" "Ranch work. Before that, Missouri. Evelyn told me about the farm." A slight pause. "She told you?" "She tells me most things," Ruth said. "Eventually." She looked at him with the particular directness of a woman who has spent years in a territory that rewards plain speaking. "I want you to know that I was against her staying initially. I thought she was making a decision based on shock and circumstance and the particular irrationality of nearly being shot at." Colt looked at her steadily. "That's a reasonable concern," he said. "It was," Ruth agreed. "I've revised it." She picked up her fork. "She hasn't looked like someone waiting for something to end in 9 years. Possibly longer." She served herself pie with the finality of someone who has said what needed saying and is now ready to move to the next thing. "The pie is good, Mabel." "Thank you," Mabel said, in the tone of a woman who knows when she is not the central subject of a sentence. Evelyn had been looking at her plate through this exchange. She looked up now and found Colt looking at her, and his face was doing the warm thing it did, the thing that had stopped surprising her somewhere around December and had started being simply part of the landscape of her days, as natural and necessary as the morning light through the east windows of the schoolroom. She looked back at her plate, because Ruth was still watching, and Ruth had excellent vision. Theodora Banks arrived on a Tuesday with 2 trunks and a confident stride that Evelyn liked immediately, before they had exchanged more than a greeting. She was 28, dark-haired, with the look of someone who has made a considered decision and is at peace with it, which Evelyn recognized from the inside as a specific and not particularly common condition. They spent the first 2 days going through the school together, the enrollment, the levels, the arrangement of the room, the particular quirks of the children. Theodora took notes in a small book and asked precise questions and had several suggestions that were good enough that Evelyn adopted them before the week was out. On the 3rd day, she taught her first lesson, and Evelyn sat at the back of the room and watched. She was good. Not identically good. Her method was more structured than Evelyn's, more systematic, less improvisational, but genuinely, substantively good in the way that mattered, which was that the children were paying attention because they wanted to know what came next, and not because they were afraid of the alternative. At noon, Evelyn walked out to the porch and stood in the March sun, which was not yet summer hot but was warm enough to be kind, and she felt something shift in her chest in the manner of a counterweight that has been doing its job long enough to be released. The school was going to be fine. She had not realized until the counterweight released how much of her energy for 6 months had been directed at that specific outcome. Not just teaching, but making the things stable enough to survive past her, which was what you did when you were the only thing holding something up and were aware that one person was never enough. Now there were two of them. In September, Alderman had mentioned a third hire from the Territorial Education Board. The railroad survey team had confirmed the route in January. The first crews were expected in fall. Red Mesa Crossing was going to be a different place in 2 years. Evelyn was going to be here to see it. She sat on the porch step and let herself feel that fully, which was not something she had allowed herself to do during the 6 months of building, when there had always been the next thing to worry about. She let herself feel what it was to be a person who had arrived somewhere and was still there, not in the waiting sense, but in the built sense. Not waiting for the life to begin, but already in it, already wearing its particular shape. Colt came around the side of the building at that exact moment, which she suspected was not accidental. He sat on the step beside her, close but not touching, in the way they had learned to occupy space together, aware of the gap, not in the sense of absence, but in the sense of something held deliberately, a mutual understanding that the closing of it would happen on its own time and not before. "Theodora's good," she said. "I heard," he said. "Sadie came to tell me during the noon break." "Sadie's been watching her like a hawk." "Sadie watches everyone like a hawk. She's going to be extraordinary," Evelyn said. "Not about Theodora," he knew. "She already is," he said. They sat in the March sun and listened to the sounds of the schoolroom behind them. Theodora's voice, clear and direct, a question from one of the younger children, the creak of the bench when someone shifted. Down the street, the construction sound that had been a constant background noise since February, the beginnings of 2 new buildings going up in anticipation of the railroad population. The fiddle player on his porch, very faintly, a tune she didn't know. "I need to tell you something," Colt said. She waited. He turned his hat in his hands, the gesture she had long since stopped seeing as a nervous one and had come to understand as simply the way he collected his thoughts. "The association's been asked to expand," he said. 2 new territories east of here. They want me to head it up." A pause. "It would mean travel. Weeks at a time sometimes." She looked at him. "Is it something you want?" He considered it. "It's something I'm good at," he said, "and it needs doing. The expanded territory's got the same problems this one had 3 years ago, and if nobody addresses it early—" He stopped. "But it's not what I'm asking." "What are you asking?" He looked at her directly. "I'm asking if it changes things between us. If it's not—" He stopped again, which was unusual enough for him that she gave it the silence it needed. "If it's not what you planned on," he said finally. "When you stayed." She thought about this seriously, which he deserved. She thought about what she had planned on when she stayed, which had been mostly teach the children, build the school, see what came of the other part. She had not planned on specifics because she was, at her core, a woman who had learned from 9 years of over-planning the deeply uncomfortable lesson that a life too rigidly planned produces a life that fits like a coat belonging to someone else. "What are you asking me exactly?" she said. "Because it sounds like you're circling something." He looked at his hat, then at the street, then at her. "I'm asking if you'll marry me," he said. "And I'm asking with full knowledge that I have a job that takes me away from home, and that I'm younger than you by 9 years, and that the frontier is a difficult place to live and we're not even through the first winter yet, and that you've been married before in a way that probably makes the word mean something complicated to you now." He met her eyes. "I'm asking you knowing all of that, and I'm not asking you to decide today, and I need you to know that whatever you say, I intend to be here. That part doesn't change." It was the longest speech she had heard him make. It was also the most accurate accounting of the actual situation she had been given by another person in recent memory. No softening, no strategic omission, no version of the question designed to make the answer easier. Just the thing itself, with all its real weight, handed to her plainly. She loved him for it. She had loved him since November, and she loved him now. And she was aware this was still not the safest thing she had ever felt, but was the most honest one. "Colt," she said, "you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." She used his own formulation back at him, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, and something softer underneath it. 9 years is not a significant difference, she said. Not in people who have both had to grow up past the age they were when they did it. She looked out at the main street. The job doesn't frighten me. I have a job too. I have a school. The weeks you're away, I'll be working, and the weeks you're here, we'll be together. And that seems to me like a life that belongs to both of us, rather than one that requires either of us to become a smaller version of ourselves to make it fit. He was very still. And the other part, she said, the word and what it means now, you're right that it's complicated. Richard was... She stopped, found the honest version. Richard was a man who wanted a wife as a function. I was a function that learned to resent the position. She looked at Colt. You have never once looked at me as though I were a function. You asked me to stay because the town needed a teacher and the children needed someone, and you... She paused. You wanted me. Not a version of me that was convenient. Me. Yes, he said quietly. That's right. Then yes, she said. That's my answer. The word sat between them in the March sunlight, simple and enormous. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the careful steadiness, not the alert watchfulness, but something openly and vulnerably glad. The face of a man who has been braced for the weight of something for so long that its absence makes him briefly uncertain of his own balance. Then he reached over and took her hand and held it and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. Behind them in the schoolroom, the children were learning something, and the afternoon was coming in gold through the east windows, and the fiddle at the end of the street found its way into a tune she recognized at last as an old one, the kind that has been played so many times in so many places that it has stopped belonging to anyone in particular and become simply part of the air. Sam. They married in May, on a Saturday in front of the hotel, because it was the largest flat space in the settlement, and Mabel had made it known that if the ceremony happened anywhere that wasn't within view of her front door, she was going to be displeased. 29 people came, which was most of the town, plus Ruth, who had stayed 3 weeks past her original visit and now seemed to be in no particular hurry to return to Yuma. It was not a large ceremony. Evelyn had not wanted large. She had also not wanted the kind of ceremony that required her to wear something she would never wear again and stand in a particular posture for a particular duration, performing a particular emotional state for the benefit of observers. She wore her best dress, which was the blue wool she had bought in Philadelphia the week before leaving, and which fit well and was the color of creek water in the particular shifting light, more blue some moments, more gray in others. Colt wore his better jacket, which was not his best jacket, because his best jacket had been relegated to actual best jacket status and was being preserved for his funeral or some equivalent occasion, as she had discovered when she asked about it. "Where's the gray jacket?" she had said the morning of. "I only wear that for significant occasions," he said. She had looked at him for a long moment. "This is a significant occasion," she said. He had gone and put on the gray jacket. The ceremony was short and direct, conducted by aldermen who had, it turned out, the authority to perform one, and who approached the task with the same compact efficiency he brought to everything. Evelyn said what she meant and meant what she said, and Colt said the same, and the 29 people watching were not required to wait a long time, which was appropriate given that several of them were children with limited tolerance for standing still. Sadie stood at the front of the assembled group, beside her mother. In the dress that had been mended so many times it had become a record of itself. She held her composure through the ceremony with the particular dignity of a child who has decided this is an occasion that deserves her best self, and she delivered it. When it was done, and people were beginning to move toward the food Mabel had organized, Sadie came and stood in front of Evelyn. "You're really here now," she said. It was the same thing she had said in October, and it was not the same thing at all. "I'm really here now," Evelyn said. Sadie nodded. Then she went to find the twins, who had already gotten into something they shouldn't have, which was their natural state at any social gathering. Ruth appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. "I like him," she said, watching Colt across the gathering, where he was talking to Doc Yates with his hat in his hand and his gray jacket, and the easy stance of a man who is in the right place. "I know," Evelyn said. "You told him so in November." "I tell the truth early," Ruth said. "It saves time." She was quiet for a moment. "You should come to Yuma, sometime, just to see." "I'll come," Evelyn said. "In the fall. The school will be settled by then. Theodora has it." Ruth looked at her. "You're not afraid anymore," she said, "of starting over." I'm always afraid, Evelyn said. I've just decided it's not a reason not to move. Her sister considered this. That's a better philosophy than the one you left Philadelphia with. The one I left Philadelphia with was don't feel anything until you're somewhere safe. And you stopped? Evelyn looked at the gathering, at Mabel carrying a plate with the authority of a woman who feeds people as an act of love, at Marcus sitting with two of the younger children and explaining something with his hands while they watched with enormous attention, at Colt turning from Yates and finding her across the crowd with the uncomplicated ease of someone who has learned where to look. At the settlement behind them, the new buildings going up, the main street with its dust and its plainness and its fiddle player at the end. I stopped, she said. Marcus left for Tucson in August, on a scholarship arranged through a territorial education program that Evelyn had spent 4 months corresponding with, and that Agnes Cole had supported from the Philadelphia end, with the particular determined efficiency of a woman who had been placing teachers for 20 years and had decided that Marcus was the most interesting challenge she'd encountered recently. He came to say goodbye on the morning of his departure. He stood in the schoolroom door. He was taller than he'd been in September, a fact that still occasionally surprised her, with his bag and his hat, and the particular expression of someone on the edge of something enormous, who is trying to appear smaller than the moment. You'll be studying with a man named Garrett, Evelyn said. He's exacting. He won't soften things to spare your feelings. Good, Marcus said. I don't need that. I know you don't. She looked at him. You're going to find it harder than you expect and better than you imagine. Both things will be true. How do you know? Because that's what happens when you go somewhere real, she said. Every time. He was quiet. He looked at the blackboard, which had tomorrow's lesson on it in Theodora's handwriting. I didn't think I was going anywhere, he said, when I came here. You were 14 and hiding in the back of the room, she said. You had some adjusting to do. Something crossed his face, and not quite a smile, but the older version of it, the one that knows what it's about. You saw that. I see everything, she said. Occupational. He shifted his bag. He was 14 when she'd met him, and he was 15 now, and in 2 years would be 17, and in 3 would be beyond what anyone here could teach him in mathematics. And this was exactly as it should be, and also cost her something to think about, which was also exactly as it should be. Mrs. Mercer, he said, her new name, which she was still occasionally surprised by. Thank you. You did the work, she said. I just didn't get out of the way. He went. She watched him through the window, walking down the main street with his bag and his hat and his future, and the August morning was clear and already warm, and the settlement was going about its business around him, and he did not look back, which was right. She turned to the blackboard. She erased Theodora's lesson and wrote her own. Itam. There are things you learn about yourself in places you did not plan to be. Evelyn learned that she was more capable of physical hardship than she had been told, by the culture she'd grown up in, by the marriage she'd submitted to, by the quiet, accumulated suggestion that women of a certain background and education were suited to certain kinds of rooms and no others. She learned that this was false, specifically and categorically false, and that the discovery of a lie you've been living inside is uncomfortable in the way that resetting a bone is uncomfortable, necessary and briefly terrible and clarifying in a way nothing less severe could achieve. She learned that belonging is not a thing that is given to you. She had believed, without examining it, that belonging was something other people granted, that you arrived somewhere and were accepted or not, included or not, recognized or not, and that this was the determining factor. What she found in Red Mesa Crossing was different. Belonging was something you built, daily, in the unglamorous ordinary way, by showing up, by doing the work, by being present when it was inconvenient and staying when it would have been easier to go. The children hadn't belonged to her because they'd accepted her. They'd belonged to her because she'd refused to stop showing up for them. She learned that love between adults is less like the things she'd been told it was, and more like what she'd watched it actually be. In Colt's consistent presence, in the letters he wrote carefully on the 4th draft, in the fact that when she was sick in February with a chest cold that lasted 2 weeks, he came to the schoolhouse quarters every evening and sat across the table and talked about ordinary things so that the silence didn't press in. And he never once made her feel like a burden for needing that, which was a thing she had not known a person could do until she saw someone do it. She learned, most essentially, that the woman she had been at 26, the one who had married Richard for the relief of being chosen and had spent 9 years slowly disappearing inside that choice, was not the only version of herself available. That version had been built from the outside in, shaped by what other people required of her. The version she was building now was the other direction, inside out, from what she actually was, which turned out to be more capable and more stubborn and more willing to be in the middle of difficult things than she had given herself credit for. This is not a comfortable thing to learn late. She would have preferred to know it at 25. But late is not the same as too late, and the frontier, which is a place of contingency and revision and the constant necessity of working with what you actually have rather than what you wished you had taught her that one too. In October, the first railroad crew arrived. They came in wagons, 40 men and their equipment and their noise, and they camped on the south edge of the settlement and within a week had established a kind of temporary city that felt nothing like the Red Mesa crossing Evelyn had walked into 12 months before. The main street was busier. Alderman's store ran out of flour twice in the first week and had to send for resupply. 2 new businesses announced themselves, a second dry goods and what appeared to be a barber shop, though the sign was ambiguous. Evelyn watched the settlement change from the schoolhouse porch and felt the familiar mix of things, the loss of the smaller, quieter place, and the reality of what more people meant for the children who were already there and the children who were coming. She had the same conversation with Theodora that she'd had with herself in September, and Theodora, who was settling into Red Mesa Crossing with the same considered purposefulness she applied to everything, said, "The school doesn't stay the same when the town doesn't. That's not a problem. That's what schools do." The school board, formally constituted in September with Alderman as chair, approved the third teacher hire in November, a man named Horace Webb, 42, from Ohio, who had taught mathematics and natural science for 15 years, and who arrived in December with a quiet competence and a complete indifference to the social architecture of a small settlement that Evelyn found immediately restful. The schoolroom that had held 17 children in September of the previous year now held 34. By spring it would hold more, and there were plans for a second building with 2 additional classrooms, approved by the Territorial Education Board in October, funded in part by a contribution from the railroad company that the board had negotiated with a firmness that Evelyn had found quietly satisfying to witness. Sadie was 11 now. She spent her lunch breaks helping the youngest students with their letters, with the natural ease of someone for whom teaching is not a performance but simply what she does, the way some people breathe through their mouths and some through their noses. Evelyn watched her sometimes from the door of the classroom, this child who had said people always leave with the flat acceptance of someone who had made her peace with the world's indifference, and thought about what it meant to show a person, not tell them, but show them, that some things stay. It does not fix everything, knowing that. Sadie was still